What if directions were policies?
If you listen slowly, the bell counts to 13.
Narrow the story. When the map inhales, a coastline remembers itself.
Some pages resist by remembering pressure, not ink.
Names should bruise, gently, so they can heal true.
I broke my oath the night the candles bled salt. You are taught, if you serve long enough underground, that wax can be disciplined the way a choir can melt it into obedience, poured into silence, trimmed to a perfect, pious height. But the candles in the corridor outside the catalog room did not bow to order that night. Their tears crystallized into small white grains that bit my fingertips when I gathered them from the stones. I kept one grain in my mouth until it dissolved. It tasted like the sea, like rusted keys, like breath held too long. If I am confessing, understand what that means. I am telling you, I placed contraband salt on my tongue and waited for the truth to sting. My name used to have 3 parts and a suffix that meant of the archives. But names are bookplates, and bookplates can be peeled off. For years, I was a librarian, the way a locksmith is a musician. There is a rhythm to unlocking, a tempo to hinges. Then I was an exorcist, the way a doctor is a historian. My work was not simply to drive something out, but to record what it changed while it was inside. Librarian-Exorcist sounds theatrical to ears that have not learned the practicalities of hauntings. Hauntings are not shrieks and clattering chains. They are misfiled dates, adjectives that reappear in different chapters against orders, paragraphs that refuse to lie down in the syntax assigned to them. They are candles that weep salt instead of wax. You will ask how such a profession is trained. Quietly, at first, I arrived at the basilica as a copyist with neat lines and poor stamina. My breath went ragged on the 69th step descending to the first landing. A senior custodian with a lantern paused beside me and said, 7 in, 7 out. The steps obey breath, not feet. He kept walking. I learned later that there is a count to everything underground. The locks, the latches, the racks of keys hanging like frozen chimes, the prayers sewn into leather spines, the time it takes for ink to dry, and the time it takes for memory to pretend it has. I learned to walk like a metronome. I learned to speak only when the stones allowed it. There is a room, no window, a ceiling low enough to make you respectful where initiation takes place. We call it the index chamber. It teaches you the 2 axioms of our craft. The first axiom, silence isn't sacred, it is enforced. The second, memory is heavier than metal. The test is simple. They lay 4 objects on a table: a key ring, a lead weight, a prayer rope, and a paper scrap covered in forgotten handwriting. Your task is to pick the heaviest. If you choose the lead, you go upstairs and you copy titles from catalog cards for the rest of your life, safe among the curators who think the world is a sequence. If you choose the key, you become a runner and scurry with messages along corridors no one else will learn. If you choose the rope, you join the rites and become a good man people forget to fear. I put my hand on the paper scrap and could not lift it on the first try. The paper grew heavier the more I thought of reading it. The examiners nodded. You cannot exorcise without recognizing weight. My oath was taken under frescoes whose eyes were painted shut. It is easier to promise what you cannot measure if every face near you is refusing to witness. We swore to preserve the catalogue, to protect the sleeping from their own curiosity, and to correct the kind of mistakes that make decades slide out of their joints. We swore to never read without permission, and to never permit reading without consequence. We swore to salt the candles when we were told. The formula was old, the Latin precise, the cadence gently lulling like a lullaby that hit a blade. When they gave me my first lamp and my first leather satchel, I felt proud the way a novice surgeon might feel holding a scalpel. Then they placed beside the lamp a small bottle of white crystals. For the wicks, the mentor said, wax remembers shapes. Salt remembers absences. I do not know how to tell the uninitiated what a corridor does to a mind when the mind is made of pages and the corridor is made of edits. We called the main thoroughfare the scriptorium spine. On good nights, it smelled like bees and old linen. On bad nights, it smelled like the inside of a tooth. The stones sweat on humid evenings and exhale when the bells above miscount the hour. You count with them, 7 in, 7 out. You count because numbers keep your thoughts from wandering into the open mouth of a wrong door. There are hundreds of doors, many of them wooden, a few iron, some nothing more than shadows with hinges. There is a mischief to how doors behave. A door that opens every Thursday at dawn will stay sealed for a month if a petition written in the wrong hand has been submitted to a clerk who never existed. We learned the registers of these moods. We learned to bribe them with patience. Once, early, I bribed a door with impertinence. I knocked when knocking was prohibited. The door opened because I had violated a law. And sometimes the tunnels are hungry for small crimes to prevent larger ones. Inside was a room filled with bound volumes chained to oak rails. Chained books are not uncommon. Even university libraries used them once, but these chains were braided with thread that made my teeth ache. I tasted iron filings without putting anything in my mouth. On the first lectern lay a gospel with its title burned away in a perfect rectangle, as if a censor had used a ruler and a flame. But in the charred window, faint letters rose when I tilted my head. It was the sheen of a fish beneath water, the suggestion of scripture that refused to be extinguished by description. I did not read it then. I gilded the edges of my curiosity with duty and backed out of the room. I did not think of it again until the night the candles bled. Our discipline requires logs. We write everything down. We do not believe the logs. We write them anyway. The act of writing is less about truth than about friction. The papers resist the slyness of forgetting. My entries were neat, my script narrow. 10th of October, I wrote once. Salt administered to 5 candles in Corridor V, witnessed by Custodian Morello. Low static in the ink room, whispering confined to folio margins of unclassified catechetical text. You might think I am embroidering when I speak of whispering margins. Paper talks. It does not speak words. It speaks insistence. A margin that has been scraped clean will hum faintly until you fill it again. A page cut too square will complain until you give it a bruise. Our work, most nights, was nothing more dramatic than soothing the temper of materials that had been disciplined by centuries of good intentions. There is a ritual the public never sees, and the initiated pretend to ignore. We call it the passing of the breath. 2 librarians face each other across a narrow table with a manuscript between them. One breathes in slowly as the other breathes out, matched to the cadence of silent hours above. The aim is to synchronize with the stone so the manuscript can be turned without waking the thing that sleeps between its lines. If you move paper against the grain at the wrong hour, you can stir unfriendly geometry. The first time I felt the paper move under my hand as if a small creature were rolling from margin to margin, I thought it was fatigue, a tremor born of nerves. The second time, the letters on the right column leaned toward me, just slightly, like listeners. My partner, a woman who wore her hair like a curtain against the corridors, said in a voice light as dust, "Keep the cadence. If it listens, it can be listened to." I am telling you these practicalities because the glamour of secrets harms the truth. Dark corridors and forbidden spines are only the scenery. The work is custodial. We swept more than we speculated. We mended more than we revealed. We carried wooden supports for broken bindings the way nurses carry pillows for fractures that never healed right. There were nights we spent with needles, sewing vellum that had split like weathered skin. If a book is stitched too tight, it holds its breath and pages crack. If it is stitched too loose, it loses its posture and invites vermin. I loved those nights. Love is the right word. I loved the caretaking. Even now, with my oath shattered and my name unspined, I remember the quiet elation of turning a ruined folio into something that could survive another 100 years. If the tunnels offered a faith, it was the liturgy of repair. But repair is not neutral when the catalog itself has opinions about what deserves to live. We were guided by red slips tucked into certain spines, for consultation by permission only, to be cited as accident, to be described as apocrypha while being used as scripture. The instructions were handwritten by hands we never met and signed with sigils rather than names. A broken halo with 7 points, like the spokes of a wheel, appeared on many of those slips. When I asked a senior what it meant, he said, "Meteorological anomalies." He said it the way a man says, "Go home," to a dog that has wandered onto a busy street. I followed orders. I learned not to look up when a sigil burned through the paper like frost in reverse. I learned to sleep when the bells insisted it was 10, even when the moon argued for 11. On the night that matters, the bells miscounted twice. The first miscount was ordinary. The basilica above has a way of forgetting itself after the long chant. The second miscount tasted like electricity in my teeth. I was on supply rounds, stepping into the catalog room to collect a small mahogany box of wicks when the triad of candles by the door began to gutter. I knelt with the lamp on the floor and pinched each wick to raise it. My fingers came back dusted white. On impulse, I touched my tongue to the residue. It was salt. The air around the shelves tightened as if the room had taken in a breath and not let it go. There is a protocol when substances behave like symbols. You consult the ledger. Not the ledger of fallen stars that book was at the time. A rumor, a nickname muttered by bored men who romanticized the inventory. I mean the workaday ledger mounted on its stand near the back wall, where supplies are counted and borrowings recorded. I went to that stand and found the page already turned to tonight's date. In column neatness, someone had penciled a notation: "Wicks resist wax." The handwriting was my own. That cannot be. I had not written it. I stared until it made a different sense. Perhaps I would have dismissed it. Tunnels make you gullible to your own past, if not for the errand slip pinned to the board by a nail shaped like a star. The slip carried the sigil of the broken halo. Beneath it, one instruction: Salt the candles that weep. Do not pray. Do not pray is not an instruction we receive often. Prayer is considered harmless anesthesia. It calms hands, pacifies edges. To be told not to pray is to be told to remain awake. I cupped the lamp and carried it to the corridor, where the salt kept blooming from the wicks in small crystalline tears. I pinched one candle again and watched a bubble form in the wax and then collapse, leaving a clean dent like the place on a pillow where a head used to be. I salted the 3 and then the 4 farther down. My footsteps made a low, clothy sound. Silence is not the absence of noise. It is the muffling of noise by agreement. Something had withdrawn its agreement. On the turn toward the spine, I nearly collided with Morello, the custodian whose eyes always looked like he had just been surprised by kindness. He put a finger over his lips, not to hush me, but to hush the corridor. We stood that way, listening to distance. Far along, a door sighed open and closed in a rhythm that did not match any scheduled movement. We could both tell. Schedules are a second language for those who work beneath ritual. Morello lifted his lantern. The flame leaned toward the floor, then the wall, then straightened like a dog, deciding which trail of scent deserves attention. "Ledger?" he whispered. "Ledger," I said, and we set off in opposite directions as the protocols required, to converge near the stand, to confirm or correct with 2 hands what one mind might mistake. Someone had arrived first. The supply ledger was open again, and this time a line had been drawn beneath tonight's date, with so much force that the paper had scarred the wood. Below the line, in a left-handed script I recognized from labels attached to sealed folios, a note had been added: "Witness salt. Continue without petition. Wax remembers shapes. Salt remembers absences." The repetition of that phrase, one I had been given when I received my bottle, made my stomach tighten with something like déjà vu's darker cousin. We initialed. We obeyed. We did not pray. And that is when the corridor made the sound a book makes when it is opened by a person who has asked permission for a decade and is denied on the day he needs it most. Exorcism, in the popular imagination, is a contest of wills pitched at a fever. In the tunnels it is a conversation with architecture. I left Morello at the stand and followed the sound to a door I had never catalogued. A door made of iron lattice that would have been pretty if not for the sense that it could be closed like the mouth of a trap. The latch was warm. Doors are not supposed to be warm at this depth. I do not know why I touched my forehead to the metal. Habit, perhaps. Reverence mistaken for ritual. Through the lattice I could see a room I had seen once. The chained volumes, the iron-braided thread, the fish-scale shimmer of text refusing amnesia. The gospel on the front lectern was open. No one stood at the desk, but the lamp on it burned without wick or oil. Lamps should not burn like that. I entered. I should tell you why I disobeyed the edict against unpermitted reading. It was not zeal. Zeal is young. I was older than zeal. It was not boredom. Boredom is a vice for daylight men. It was the ordinary curiosity of a person whose life has been the weighing of paper. Curiosity gets called impertinence by supervisors who are tired. I lifted my lamp and leaned over the gospel. The burn rectangle did its shimmer, and in the shimmer a word rose and lowered like a breast under a sheet. Not a syllable I could pronounce, not a name I could accuse, but a shape of intention script that remembered itself as it hardened against erasure. In the margin, In a hand unlike the book's main text but perfectly in step with its pressure, a note waited. "If the candles bleed," it said in a language that used 4 alphabets like interchangeable combs, "count your breath backward and do not trust a date." It is hard to describe the relief and the panic of being warned by a dead man's margin in the exact hour you require it. Relief because you are no longer alone. Panic because you are no longer ignorant. I counted backward. 7 out, 7 in. 6 out, 6 in. The corridor exhaled with me. Somewhere above us, the bells attempted a correction and failed, struck twice against their own echo, and the air took on a new geometry angles where there had been curves, a sharper corner to the shadow of the lectern, a slant to the flame that made it look like catechism in revolt. The chains on the other volumes did not rattle. They lay with the stillness of obedient soldiers. I thought of my training, of the nights teaching my hands to weigh paragraphs the way a butcher weighs cuts, to know when a page has the heft of a confession and when it has the cool lightness of a receipt. This page had the heaviness of something that would survive us all unless someone taught it how to let go. The gospel is not what opened me. It was the ledger beneath it. It had been hiding under the larger book, like a child under a table. Thin, no title, a leather the color of dried blood made honest by years of hands. The binding was stitched in a pattern I had only ever seen on navigators' logs, the kind kept in chests that smell of brine and rope. The front edge was salted, not dust salt, fine as breath. I set the gospel aside to spare it from my curiosity and pulled the ledger close. The first page was blank in a way that is not the absence of ink but the presence of refusal. The second page bore a sigil I did not want to see. The broken halo with 7 points, pressed deep enough to be read with shut eyes. The third page I could not open. The hinge held like a jaw clenched by a man who has learned not to answer questions without witnesses. I placed my palm on the leather, and the salt burned my skin as if the book were hot where the room was cold. I suppose this is where I should say, I heard a voice. It would be satisfying to you. You expect voices in confessions. But the ledger did not speak in sound. It spoke in weight. A sentence entered behind my eyes without syllables. It said, "Not yet." I withdrew my hand as if somebody had slapped it for reaching toward a cake at a wake. My lamp sputtered. The wick, which had not been in need of trimming, curled in on itself like a creature trying to become smaller. Rage rose in me. And shame for the rage. How quaint to be angry at a book, when the world above me had been edited into the shape of a story the corridors were tired of telling. I whispered a prayer without words. I violated the instruction. I prayed. Nothing happened. And that, too, was a happening. The ledger did not punish me. It simply remained not yet. When I left the chained room, the corridor had grown a fraction narrower. The stones compress when they are listening. I met Morello halfway to the stand. His lantern was out, his face lit only by the reflection of my flame. "You smell like brine," he said, as if accusing the ocean of being wet. "The candles," I said, and he nodded like a man nods at rain. He lifted his hand and showed me his thumb and forefinger, white with crystals. "It's in the wicks along the 6th, too," he said. "Salt belongs to the walls, to the sweat of saints, to spilled soup on feast nights, to the skin of men who have carried rope. It doesn't belong to wicks." He wanted me to disagree so he could instruct me like a mentor. I did not disagree. I told him about the note in the margin, the count backward, the instruction not to trust a date. He crossed himself 3 times in a pattern that was not ours, and then stopped, embarrassed by the habit leaking from his childhood. "Don't write that part," he said, meaning the part where a man trained in protocols resorted to old reflex. We returned to the ledger stand together and found, for the 3rd time that night, an addition to the page. I had left the line deep enough to scar the wood. Now someone had stamped the column with a small seal in purple wax. The impression was not the broken halo, it was a compass without a north. Every direction led toward obedience. The wax was new, warm enough to smudge. I lifted the corner with my thumbnail and smelled the faint perfume that marks documents meant to travel quickly and quietly. "This is not our house's seal," Morello whispered. "The tunnels do not exist alone. There are neighbors beneath cities the way there are neighbors in tenements. Sometimes they borrow sugar, sometimes they borrow silence. We had been visited. I wonder, as I speak to whatever machine or stranger is catching these words, whether the above sounds like the delirium of a tired clerk, the embroidery of a man trying to dress his guilt in psalms. I hope not. The truth is less glamorous and more frightening. In the name of cataloging, we consented to the management of memory. We told ourselves it was kindness. Harm often wears the face of shepherding. When families donated their chests of papers, we accepted them with gratitude and then made decisions about what should be read and what should be placed where fingers could not reach. We did not throw away. We reassigned. Reassignment looks like mercy when your job is to keep fires small. And yet the salt, the night the candles bled, I dreamed standing up. We do that sometimes, leaning against stone, eyes open in the way that means nothing is entering. In my standing dream I walked the spine, counting in reverse as the margin advised, and each number shed a piece of calendar like bark. I stepped over discarded months, curled like sleeping animals. I stepped around a feast whose name had been scraped off, and a funeral that had been given a birthday because it improved attendance. I stepped past a baptismal registry that contained the same child 5 times, each time with a new patron saint, each time making that saint more real to anyone watching. And at the end of the corridor the ledger waited again, its salt a thin crust on a shoreline I had never seen with my open eyes. My hand reached. "Not yet," it said, but softer. "Wait for the hour that does not exist." I woke to Morello's hand on my shoulder, though I had not slept, and the low stroke of a bell that had not been scheduled. 13, he said, and smiled in the hopeless way of men who like numbers too much to hate them when they misbehave. He handed me the ledger from the stand, the ordinary one, and said, "Write it." I wrote, "Unscheduled chime, wicks weeping salt, instruction forbidding prayer, margin advising reverse breath count, compass, seal with no north." My letters were the steady skeleton of a person who has put his nerves aside for later weeping. We signed, we initialed, we placed the ledger back and waited for the corridor to give us our next sentence. It gave me exile. Not immediately. Not with fanfare. Exile in our world is administrative. You find a new corridor that no one admits is attached to the old one. You are given a set of keys that look like the set you had, except they are colder and do not sing when they touch. You are assigned candles that do not bleed. You are told to mind the dust and the mice, and, if you are lucky, the infants who will be brought to you to learn first letters on the backs of catalog cards that have been retired with ceremony and a lie. But exile begins the night you learn to dislike the smell you loved. Bees and linen become tooth and iron. What tasted like duty tastes like a cheap medicine decanted into a gold vial. The ledger under the gospel had tasted my hand. The salt had tasted my blood. The corridor had tasted my disobedience. I was marked, therefore kept. If you are waiting for thunder, I apologize. Confessions are thunderstorms in plays. In archives, they are weather reports written in pencil by people who cannot afford to dramatize what they can barely afford to describe. I will give you one flash, though, for the sake of keeping your attention honest. As I left the chained room for the second time, as I turned to latch the iron lattice, I saw reflected in the black of the lamp glass, not in the air, the faint impression of letters above my left shoulder, where the fresco eyes were painted shut. The letters formed a word that meant ledger in a language I had not studied. Then the letters unformed, as if ashamed to have been legible. I did not turn around to look at the wall. I watched the lamp glass until it showed only flame and my own face made small by the grid. If a place begins to write at you, you must decide whether you will be the kind of reader who corrects punctuation or the kind who risks being corrected. I had taken my oath to become the first kind. I am speaking now because I became the second. The bottle of salt I had kept since my novice days, the one I had been instructed to sprinkle on wicks when the house required, felt heavier in my satchel as I walked the spine back toward my bench. I touched it through the leather and felt, I swear it, a pulse. Salt does not pulse. I stopped under the arch where the plaster is cracked into a pattern we call the Sleeping River and set my satchel down and opened it and took the bottle out. The cork had worked loose. A few grains leafed onto my palm. They did not roll the way salt rolls. They sat, stubborn, like a measure being taken. I placed one again on my tongue, foolish as a boy at the shore tasting tide for the first time. It stung. It tasted like a name being erased letter by letter with the care of a mother cutting her child's hair. I spat it onto the stones and wiped my mouth with the back of my hand like a man who has kissed the wrong confession. All I had, then, was the discipline of logs and the cadence of breath. So I logged. I counted. 7 out, 7 in, 6 out, 6 in. The corridor softened a fraction, as if a listener had leaned back. I took steps that were not exactly mine down a hallway I had traveled 1,000 times and found, without intending, the door to the index chamber. The fresco eyes were still closed. The table still bore the 4 objects: the keyring, the lead weight, the prayer rope, the scrap of paper covered in handwriting that belongs to a species of forgetting the tunnels invented. I had chosen once. I chose again. I put my hand on the paper and tried to lift it. This time, it rose easily. My body had learned its heft. The heaviest thing in the room, I realized, was not the paper anymore. It was the door. I will tell you the rest. The breathing map and the calendar that eats its own tail and the ledger that says not yet until it says now, but not here, not in this first mouthful. Confessions must obey their own liturgy. First, you admit the nature of your oath. Then you strip it of adornments. Then you name the night it failed. This is my naming. The candles bled salt. The corridor exhaled through its teeth. The chained room opened its jaw for the second time in my care and did not bite. A ledger with no title burned my palm politely and refused to speak. A seal with a compass that pointed only toward obedience melted while I watched, as if it were trying to become water again. I breathed backward. I mistrusted the date. I did not pray until I did, and when I did, prayer failed on purpose so that I would not mistake anesthesia for consent. If you are listening from a bed, if your room is washed with the safe dimness we wish for those who sleep, I do not ask you to believe me. Belief is the cheap coin of late hours. I ask you to weigh. Put your mind on the scale with the key, with the lead, with the rope, with the scrap. Feel which one drags your wrist toward the table. If the paper tugs, even a little, if you feel the heaviness of something written and scraped and written again, if you feel the ache in your knuckles that comes from turning a page that did not want to be turned, then we are already in the same room, whether or not the door between us decides to be generous tonight. And if you taste salt in the air, though your window looks inland, do not think first of storms. Think of candles. Think of wicks. Think of wax remembering shapes, and salt remembering absences, and of a man whose name used to have a suffix that meant of the archives, standing with a bottle in his hand, wondering whether he has the right to keep lighting the dark in a house that longs, some nights, to be honest about being a cave. It's a strange discipline, learning to let the floor lead you. The architects down here were less interested in corridors than in currents, and the stones still remember where those currents meant to go. The night after the candles bled, the basilica above coughed out its last tour groups and locked its polite doors. Down below, the corridors unbuttoned a little. We call it the loosening the hour, when the tunnel air turns the temperature of kept secrets, and every latch feels a fraction more articulate than it did at vespers. I did not intend to find the map that night. Intention is loud. The tunnels dislike loud. I set out with a broom, a rag, and the ledger of ordinary days tucked like a tame animal beneath my arm. Morello had said, half to himself, that salt in wicks means the rooms want to tell you what they've been keeping from you. Rooms are like old men, he said. They pretend they've forgotten. Then they confess to a wall. I turned left at the sleeping river crack, and right at the arch, studded with nails that were hammered in, according to legend, by a penitent blacksmith who wanted a ladder to heaven and got an echo. 7 in, 7 out. My breath in the corridor reached détente. The first sign that the floor had decided for me was the small rebellion of dust. Usually it flees the brush docile little storms that scuttle toward the corners and make their nests behind footings. Tonight it formed a seam I could not sweep across, a pale, stubborn stitch running along the flagstones like a sentence I hadn't learned to read. I followed that seam into a cul-de-sac that is not on the catalog maps, the kind of cul-de-sac that appears whenever the basilica's bells strike an extra note. There, set into the wall at knee height, was a low iron hatch with no handle. Hatches like that usually lead to pipes or pity. This one breathed, not like a lung, exactly. More like the bellows of an old organ, a slow, dry in and out that carried a smell of glue and old fish and the faint, unpleasant spice of varnish aged past its pride. I put my palm to the metal. It was cool and patient. The seam of dust ended here, folded into a neat little comma at the hatch's lip. "All right," I said, as if bargaining with a cat. "You win." I set the broom aside, found the notch with my thumbnail, and pried. The hatch opened with a sigh that felt rehearsed. The chamber beyond was low enough to insist on humility, but wide enough to be grand in its own way, an overturned bowl of stone. The ceiling bore the faint scorch marks of old lamps. The floor, raised a handspan on wooden blocks, was a raft in a dark, shallow sea. At the center of that raft lay a table the size of a small boat, and on that table, pinned at the corners with iron clamps and bridled at the edges with leather straps that looked oiled yesterday, sprawled a map. I have seen many maps. The polite ones upstairs, with their cheerful blues and their operatic fonts. The secret ones downstairs, with annotations that creep across margins like ivy and with C's drawn the color of bruises. This map belonged to neither caste. It had been drawn on vellum that must have come from a beast so enormous you would call it a fable if someone did not show you the pores blooming in the skin under your own lamp. At first, the ink seemed ordinary sooty blacks, soft umbers, but when I leaned closer, the lines went shy. The coasts softened. The rivers shivered. A mountain range arranged itself into a different grammar of peaks, more assertion than description. I know this sounds like a trick of the light. Light is a trickster, but sometimes the trick it plays is to reveal the magician. A brass instrument lay on the table beside the map, half astrolabe, half stethoscope. I knew what it was only because an old manual in the index chamber had included a sketch with a note in the margins for listening to the latitude. You set the bell against a line of ink, the manual said, and if the line is true, you hear the low, healthy drone of good geometry. If the line is lying, if geography has been coerced into a narrative it does not own, you hear a beat. The map's lines pulsed everywhere I touched the bell, softly, politely, like something alive that didn't want to alarm me with the fact of its aliveness. When the bells above struck 11, the map inhaled. It was not dramatic. The surface tightened, taking up the slack in the straps, as if a draft had moved through a curtain and left it newly attentive to the rod. Along the western ocean, a coastline curled very slightly, the way a sleeping animal adjusts a paw and resumes pretending it is part of the furniture. On the far side, an inland sea flattened itself, smoothing a ripple into acquiescence. The brass bell in my hand thrummed once and went quiet, like a throat clearing itself of a comment it will make later in a meeting when the minutes are not being taken quite so diligently. There is a training for this, too, a catechism of cartography no one attests to in public. When the map breathes in, you count saints. When it breathes out, you count years. The practice is less mysticism than bookkeeping. The tunnels have always preferred accounting to ecstasy. I counted 6 saints whose names have a habit of migrating between calendars like birds that can't remember their winter. I counted 70 years that an obscure chronologer once tried to argue out of Europe and was made to apologize to an altar for inconvenience. The map exhaled. A river lifted its shoulder. Somewhere in Italy, an edge that has never made peace with being a boot softened into a slipper before remembering its posture. I should have called for someone. There are bells to ring when artifacts misbehave beyond a custodian's competence. But the map was not misbehaving, it was practicing. It was the disciplined body of a dancer, warming muscles no one upstairs knows she has. You have to understand, the rhetoric of suppression makes everything sound violent. This was not violence, it was maintenance. Still, maintenance has politics. The clamps were engraved with little notations, dates, initials, the short codes of committees. I read an engraving that someone had half polished and then given up on, S.C. Cron. The Sacred Congruities of Chronology. The committee that exists only when the basilica needs to insist that time is a staircase and not a spiral. Another clamp bore the same broken halo with 7 spokes impressed so deep the metal had a memory ache. My lamp flickered and returned. "You're not assigned here," said a voice mild as thread. I turned with the sheepishness of a schoolboy caught living up to his curiosity, and saw Sister Gisla, which is not her name, standing at the hatch with her hands in the sleeves of the plain wool habit that makes all habits look more honest than their wearers. She was a librarian, in the old sense, one who almost never looked directly at a book, but remembered everything it did to the person who held it. Her eyes were the gray of the wax on candles that have just considered going out and decided not to do it for your sake. "I'm sweeping," I said, "because we all start with small lies." "You're listening," she said, stepping up onto the raft. She did not look at my broom. She looked at the map as if it were a child she had raised wrong and loved anyway. "Well, then listen with both ears. We never get the 13th behaving before midnight. How long has it been?" "Breathing?" I asked, awkward with the word when applied to geography. "Longer than most bureaucrats last," she said. "Not as long as stone. Long enough to make the paperwork hard." She reached past me and loosened one leather strap a notch, the way a nurse loosens a bandage on a patient who has obliged everyone by not dying just yet. The map responded by settling a fraction. "They had to teach it to do that," she added. "At first it refused. Paper is proud. Flesh remembers instructions more politely." I put the brass bell to the ink again. The line beneath it beat once polite, insistent. "What am I hearing?" I said. "Corrections," she said. "Some of them, honest shorelines, shift when rivers get ideas. Some of them, administrative." She glanced at the clamp with the committee initials. "The world, like the church, likes to be on brand. Sometimes that requires edits." We stood quietly for a time uncounted. The map was not all the world, no map is, but it had ambitions. I traced a finger without touching along a caravan route that never made it into school books, because the people who took it traded words more than grain. I hovered over a dotted line across a sea that had been removed from polite atlases when it proved less dramatic than the stories told about it. The map's breath seemed to pool around those places, dampening the vellum with a humidity that came from memory rather than weather. "It's not alive," I said, trying to set a boundary I could live with. "It's rehearsed." Sister Gisla made a small sound that could have been agreement or pity. "What do you call a cathedral choir on a feast day?" she asked. "They are not singing new songs. Their rehearsals are older than the dust in their throats, but they're not dead either." The bells above miscounted again, a cautious extra note that made my molars respect the craft of bell founders. The map inhaled. The straps tightened. The committee clamp sighed. "Tell me the rule," she said. "When the map breathes in, we forget a saint," I recited, feeling absurd and therefore comforted. "When it breathes out, we invent a century." "In Saudi word, not invent," she said gently. "We place a century. If you say invent, you'll turn this into a play. It is already a catechism. Don't add costumes." "Forgive me," I said, and meant it in the practical sense. "Make my language fit the work, so I can do it without breaking it." She gestured toward the far corner, where a small cabinet sat with its drawers labeled in a clerk's miniature hand. I opened the top and found a regiment of metal types, the kind used in printing houses to make dates. They were arranged not in numerical order but in a logic of feasts. Movable feasts here, fixed there. Saints in a set of shallow trays with tiny handles. I took up a type slug and felt its weight. "We stamp dates?" I said, horrified by the theatricality of it. "We stamp permissions," she said. "Dates are just one uniform permissions like to wear. When this map says a shoreline will be smoothed, we give the shoreline the decency of announcing it in the papers. People like to be told what they have already decided to accept. And if the map refuses, then someone tries to fetch the old astrolabe from the glass case upstairs and improves the instrument with an exorcist," she said dryly. "It has not refused in my tenure. It has sulked. It has sighed. Once it pretended to be a rug until the bells convinced it to practice its breathing like a violinist detuning. Why you? You are last end of this." I rested my hand on the table, flat, respectful, a posture learned from the patience of other crafts, and felt the deep, slow press of the vellum, becoming briefly taut and then briefly slack, in a rhythm that was not mine and was not the basilica's, and yet was obedient to both. "Sister," I said, and the title did a kindness to my confusion. "What happens when the map breathes in too many times?" She didn't answer immediately. "Confidences have a scarcity budget. Spend too many at once, and you bankrupt the room." At last she said, "What happens to any of us who practice only forgetting? The body compensates. The breath grows shallow. The next exhale becomes a flood. Or else," she stopped, "or else the song changes key without telling the choir. That is when the committees petition for a correction." "And the ledger?" I asked before I could swallow the word. She did not feign ignorance. "Which one?" she said, in a way that admits there are several. "I did not say the fallen stars. She did not say it for me. The map tells you where the story must be plausible," she said. "The ledger tells you what must be plausible there. The map is choreography. The ledger is casting. Who writes the ledger?" "Everyone," she said, "and no one who will admit it under oath." She smiled in a way that made the straps on the map's corners look like reins. "We are midwives, not gods. Even midwives sign forms." I should have been unnerved, and I was, but the unnerving came with the practical comfort of work I could do. "What do you need?" I asked. She nodded at the brass bell. "Listen to the south coast," she said. "It has been insisting on a shallow breath for a week. There was a storm. Storms are untidy editors. The committee wants to call it divine commentary on a festival. The map wants to call it a current. I need someone who can hear the difference." I placed the bell along the coast she aimed me to, and waited. The rhythm I found there was like a murmured argument behind a sacristy door, two voices with similar accents thinking they disagree because they are tired, the current and the committee. The beat did not lie, it oscillated. "It wants both," I said, surprised to hear the words sound like sense. "It is willing to accept a procession of boats with candles if the brochures admit a prevailing wind." Sister Gisla's mouth did the thing mouths do when they hide gratified laughs from the dignity of their owners. "Write that down," she said. "Not here. In the ledger upstairs with the boring back, the one the mice find wholesome. They eat the pieties and leave the observations. It makes for better compost." We worked like that for an hour, if hour is the kind of measure that matters when ink and air and bells are deciding their own durations. She listened to my listening and corrected my corrections only when the map told her to. Twice the map exhaled, and a mountain range let a pass widen by the width of a widow's thumb. Once it inhaled, and a monastery's coastline advanced into the sea by the thickness of a confession that should have been said aloud and was not. "It's not magic," she said when I made a pilgrim's noise. "It's the maintenance of stories. The sea and the saints and the charter of a bridge are all stories that want to go on living. They trade inches to keep chapters. If I had left then, if I had bowed like the obedient locksmith I had been trained to imitate, and returned to my broom and my ledger and the corridors that kept their polite mouths shut for custodians, you would never be hearing this voice. But when the bells above stumbled no miscount, this time but a hesitation, a cough, the map changed its breathing. It took a breath that did not fit any of the forms. The straps went taut enough to squeal. The brass bell in my hand sang a thin, high tone that made my eyes blur. Sister Gisla froze the way a mother freezes when the baby in the cradle remembers how to stop breathing for alarm. "Don't touch it," she said, which meant she wanted to. "Let it choose." The line I was listening to the South Coast argument unwove itself. The ink did not fade. It spread. A narrow inlet that had been cut like a letter opener into the land widened into a bay the shape of a hand. The currents redrew their whorls. A town that did not exist moved closer to a road that had been there for centuries and would now be called new. The brass bell vibrated under my fingers like an insect too polite to bite. On the far edge, a set of marks I had dismissed as cartouches sloughed their decorative pretension and resolved into numbers I could almost read if I breathed the way the corridor prefers. I did. They meant a date that had no business living in that corner of the world. "Phantom time," I whispered before I could help myself, naming the heresy like a schoolboy who says devil just to feel the class flinch. "Shh," Sister Gisla said, but not because the word was forbidden, because sound is a coarser tool than breath. We do not call it that when we are working. We call it reconciling eras. If you accuse the past of fraud while you are wrapping its wounds, it will reopen them to make you prove your illusion. The map held the breath for a count that had no number, and then exhaled in a long, weary release. The straps relaxed. The bell went kind. The inlet was a bay. The town that did not exist had acquired a road, and therefore a reason to be remembered. "What do we stamp?" I asked, feeling like an accomplice and a nurse and a thief who only steals what was already misplaced. "We stamp nothing," she said, startling me. "We let the ledger decide how to tell it. The map has chosen. It will send someone a dream by morning, and that someone will wake thinking it is urgent to found a market where the inlet remembers being a bay. They will send a letter to a cousin with money, and the cousin will give grudgingly, which is the only gift money respects. In a year there will be boats. In 10 there will be a church. In 30 there will be a child who writes a date on a stone. We will stamp that date. Stamping before something happens is how you get calamities." We stood there together, accomplices to the respiration of a world that insists on staying legible at the cost of small, precise lies. There is an argument, I know, against that sentence. The saints I counted when the map inhaled were not small. The years I watched invented placed were not precise in the sense of mercy, but standing at the table I felt the strange, low decency of adjustments that protect the possibility of story. If you call that rationalization, I will not quarrel. Confessions are full of rationalizations tidied into parables. Sister Gisla nodded to the cabinet. "Take the bell upstairs," she said. "Return it to the glass case. Let the curators cluck. It will keep them from noticing what their own shelves are doing. And write in the ledger about the inlet's dream. Make sure to mention the cousin's reluctance. The reluctance is a hinge." "What about the seam of dust?" I said, because the seam had brought me here and I am superstitious about paying small ferrymen. She smiled the way corridors widen. "Sweep it the wrong direction," she said. "Let it refuse you once more. A seam that knows its role too well becomes a crack." I did as I was told. I am not proud of most of what I obeyed, and I am not ashamed of all of it either. The glass case upstairs received the bell and preened it as if polishing a relic could teach history to sing on key. I wrote in the ledger with the boring back, a paragraph so plain the mice might spare it out of respect, and tucked the page beneath a sheet of waxed paper because paper prefers to be pressed after it has told the truth. I returned to the seam with the broom and swept against its grain until it frayed into small, manageable eddies. The hatch watched me with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student has learned a rule he will later be required to break in a more interesting room. What I did not do, because I was still shy of the word I will use now, was ask whether the breathing map was merciful. Mercy is messy. Accounting likes to think it is cleaner. I told myself the line between mercy and maintenance is a matter of jurisdiction. The map had chosen. The ledger would phrase. The committees would stamp. The boats would carry candles to flatter a wind, and the wind would carry gossip about a candle that forgot to go out and burned a small miracle into the side of a crate. If I kept sweeping, the tunnels would go on pretending that stories and stones are the same material when kept at the right humidity. But the night had changed key. You can hear it in the hinges once you've been here long enough. Doors chirp when they are courting. They groan when they feel misused. Tonight, the latticed door to the chained room fluted a sound like a throat signing a waiver. I went there because curiosity is a muscle, and mine had finally remembered what it was for. The gospel was closed now. The ledger beneath it was not. No hands had been in the room. Dust says so. The salt on the ledger's edges had rearranged itself into a thin line, a shoreline echoing the inlet that had remembered being a bay, the same curve, the same shallow elbow, the same invitation to a boat, nailed together by a man with a cousin who lends reluctantly. "Not yet," it said, but the not yet had learned my name. I pressed my palm to the leather, and something like an afterimage of starlight spread across the skin, cold as the breath in January sacristies. The ledger did not open. It pivoted, like a sleeper turning toward a sound. I felt the weight of pages pressed with the idea of numbers that preferred to be constellations when no one was looking. I felt the small impatience of a book that has been asked to be too many metaphors for too many careful men. And then, from the spine, not the pages, but the joined flesh of them, I heard a cadence that matched the map's third inhalation. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, hold. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, release. The hold was a name. The release was a date. And I knew that when the 13th finally arrived, when the bells miscounted in the exact particular way that makes the corridors smell like the underside of a cedar lid, the ledger would stop saying not yet. When I left the room, the corridor made a small canine circle, as if deciding whether to lie down again. Sister Gisla was gone. The hatch had closed itself and ceded the cul-de-sac back to the map's privacy. The seam of dust had become ordinary dirt. Morello was asleep upright on a stool, his lantern a discipline of stubborn flame. I sat near him and did the one thing that looks least like heroism and most like permission. I waited. The basilica above dreamt its clean, stained glass dreams, and in the bones beneath, the geography practiced its devotions. You could say this was the hour I should have run, that breathing maps and salted wicks and ledgers that speak by weight are the kind of warnings that send cautious men to country parishes and cowardly men to politics. Perhaps, but this is the thing about being a librarian-exorcist. You learn that places are people who live too long, and people are places that move. You do not abandon a patient because her lungs have learned a strange rhythm. You listen with the bell until the rhythm declares the name of the song it wants to survive. Before the first real birds of morning had the courage to be mistaken for mice, I rose and made a circuit of the stations I pretend every night are merely my job. I trimmed wicks without salt, and left the salt where it would be found when it decided it had an argument to make. I logged what could be logged and put brackets around what would be a lie if I pretended to pin it. I stood at the hatch as the map did one last shallow breath, like a child's sigh after bad dreaming, and I put my hand to the iron. "Your turn," I said to the ledger in the other room, because the tunnels had done their portion, and the hour that does not exist was sauntering nearer in its soft shoes. I do not know whether the map is alive. I know that it breathes. I know that the breathing keeps the committees from doing more violence than they mean to, while they polish the story into a coin you can pay tithes with. I know that the breathing taught my lungs a patience I would use later when the ledger's pages gave names to the erasures we had been worshipping as tidy. And I know that on nights when the basilica miscounts on purpose, the map and I share a discipline, 7 in, 7 out, a pause long enough to remind the world that pauses are the only places truth can cross a corridor without bruising its shins. You will want to see it, of course. People always do when I mention breathing and ink and the way leather straps earn their employ by holding the world to a kind of polite physics. But you cannot visit it. Not because you are unworthy, because visits make artifacts behave. They become docents of themselves. They smile for cameras with a posture that injures their spines. If you want to know what the map knows, do this instead. Take a map from your childhood, the kind folded badly in a glove compartment, marred by coffee, and hold it to your ear in a quiet room. At the hour when you are too tired to lie successfully, you will not hear beating. You will hear your own lungs becoming aware of their choreography. You will feel the way your ribs make a room for decisions. The world adjusts. The world insists. It is theater only to those who want to accuse it of drama. To the rest of us, it is maintenance with a hymn book. By the time the first key turned upstairs and the basilica's polite doors yawned awake for the day's performances, the seam of dust was gone, and the hatch's breath had turned imperceptible, the way a friend's sighs become furniture when you've lived together long enough. Morello's eyes opened at the exact moment he decided to pretend he had not been sleeping. "Anything?" he asked. "Less than we feared," I said, which was true. "More than we deserve," which was also true. And enough, which is the only truth the tunnels allow before breakfast. I climbed into the light with the brass bell's ghost still tingling in my fingers, and the ledger's polite refusal warming my palm like a debt. The city was already arranging itself into rows of errands and apologies. Pigeons practiced their imitations of angels. Tourists rehearsed the faces they would make in photographs, intended to prove that awe had been achieved on schedule. I carried my broom like a staff no one would suspect of authority, and thought of a hand-shaped bay that did not exist yesterday, and will have a market by the time the cousin's reluctance has turned into a blessing disguised as a ledger entry, disguised as a receipt. The map had breathed. The world would exhale later, upstairs, in the newsprint of a local announcement no one would keep, and in the humming burble of a shop that would sell strings and salt and nails to men who think starting a harbor is a matter of lumber and not of stories that have learned how to carry candles without drowning. And deep in the cooler rooms, the ledger, the one with the broken halo, pressed so deep you could read it with your eyes closed, had turned on its side to listen to the same rhythm. "Not yet," it had said. I have made a practice of loving those words the way a doctor loves a heartbeat he can put off shocking. But love is maintenance, too, and maintenance grows impatient. The 13th was coming. The corridor's hinges had tuned themselves to it. The bells had learned the hesitation they would need to stumble convincingly. I had a bottle of salt that pulsed in my satchel, and a page in a boring ledger that mice might spare because they respect a sentence that refuses to blush. I would go back down before noon, under a pretense so modest even the hatches would be fooled. I would pass through the lattice without knocking, and not reprimand myself for the door's relief. I would lay my hand on leather and receive, at last, the weight of pages that do not turn so much as roll the world over so its other side can face the Sunday. But first I would breathe, like the map had taught me, and try not to invent a century with my impatience. 7 in, 7 out. Hold. The city exhaled with me. Upstairs, a clock believed itself. Downstairs, a coastline adjusted the angle of a rumor. I closed my eyes, and, for the first time since I earned my suffix, I looked forward to a door forgetting to lock itself. Archivists will tell you the body learns its way around a library, the way a blind pianist learns a room. The knees keep a map. The fingertips memorize where air turns cool over vellum. The ribs recognize which corridors thin your breath to the size of a whisper. After the map, I walked as if the shelves were a coastline, and my lamp a lonely lighthouse. And I let the small tides of dust and draft choose my harbor. The corridors obliged, elbowing me, almost politely, toward the chained room, as if you could be ushered back to a confession you had not yet learned to deliver. Doors remember the hands that have wronged them. The iron lattice had forgiven nothing. It opened anyway. The gospel on the front lectern was closed now, its rectangle of burnt erasure as smooth and self-possessed as a scar on a saint. Beneath it, the ledger lay patient, the salt along its edges thinner, like hoarfrost, wondering whether it should persist into a brighter morning. I did not touch it. Not yet had survived the night and earned my respect. I went instead to the second lectern, where the chain catalog breathed its tiny iron breath, a faint, metallic rasp, every time the room settled back into itself. The first book I meant to call by its right name was labeled with a lie, Liturgical Mirabilia, Anon. Such labels are the polite tuxedos we make heretics wear after they agree to stop talking. The binding told the truth. The boards were cased in linen, dyed a red so weary it had bled into the thread, and the spine carried a set of shallow scratches, like tally marks, rendered with a needle that had changed its mind. When I lifted it, the chain grew quiet, like a dog tolerating a familiar thief. I carried it to a desk and tilted the lamp so that the gloss of the page went from mirror to milk. The Magdalene Codex, that is what the old men had called it when they were not being overheard by their own caution, breathed up a smell of gum, Arabic, and weak wine, and something like rain remembered by someone who had never seen rain. Some books present their teeth. This one presented its wrists. The margins. They had been scraped in neat rectangles, paler than the text, as if someone had laid down glass and cleared away the original gloss with a blade so honest it left only the suggestion of what had been there. But when I moved my head, when the lamp's angle changed by the thickness of a thought, the emptiness took on a nap, as if letters, having been evicted, had left the impression of their bodies on the bed. The impression shone for a second, then hid, a fish's shoulder seen under water when you cannot tell whether it was truly there or just the way light explains itself to the eye. We have a discipline for this too. You do not stare at the absence. You stare at its shadow. I angled the lamp until the scrape mark caught a low slant light and the grain rose. There, faint as a woman's voice heard through linen, came the slope of an alpha, the spine of an M, the curl of a word that wanted to be murmur in one alphabet and Mirari in another. The main text, Greek's honest bones walking with Latin's solemn shoes, meant to be read aloud by obedient men in obedient rooms. The margins, though they had been the place where a hand too urgent for doctrine tried to tell the text what it was doing to the body that copied it. I heard, not words, but insistence. The page was remembering the pressure of a confession, even as it attempted to pretend the confession had never occurred. "Read softly," Sister Gisla said from behind me. She had a way of arriving as if a page had asked her to. Margins don't like to be startled after they've been shorn. "I'm not sure I'm the one reading," I said. "You're not," she agreed. "You're being read to. That's how you know a book resists. It insists on speaking first." I let the margins finish their breath. The main text told familiar stories in unfamiliar shoes. A woman whose voice is mistaken for balm, and then for danger. A teacher whose hands cure what hands had caused. A room where men decide the future of a body that isn't in attendance. Ordinary miracles, catalogued to make them easier to ignore. In the margins, the erased commentary swelled again, just enough to be felt. Not scandal procedure, lists, measurements, receipts. This is a detail readers forget. The dangerous parts are often the domestic ones. Who fed whom? How many loaves? Whether the jar was clay or skin. Whether the hair was unbound because sorrow requires it, or because binding was a tax levied by men on women who carried their own weather. I turned a leaf, and the chain purred its small warning. The next page wore a different wound. Not scraping, stitching, a long seam, mended with silk of a color chosen to apologize, ran down the inner margin. Some leaf had been removed too cleanly, too devoutly, and the codex had been sutured to pretend it had always possessed fewer words. I set 2 fingers along the suture, and felt what all sutures confess if you are kind. Reluctance. Paper heals unwillingly. I looked for the ghost of what had been taken. A caption? A household inventory? A name? The codex offered only a notion. Heavier feasts. It is as if the book remembered the weight in its middle as a woman remembers the weight of a child she carried and then did not. Who removed it? I asked. The kind of man who calls himself temporary, Sister Gisela said. Temporary men are the most permanent. They think their edits will dissolve in the pot of history. History keeps the salt. I made the sign archivists make when they agree, and fear their agreement is an endorsement. Then I set the Magdalene aside and reached for the volume next to it, labeled De Apparatu Sancto, in a hand that didn't trust its own calligraphy. The Catalogue of Dissolved Devices. I knew it by reputation, a book that turned machines into liturgy. The binding had been reinforced with brass in the corners, like a hymn book that had survived sailors. Inside, diagrams drawn with a necessary ugliness, the unhandsome precision of men who would rather build than persuade. Pulleys, wedges, siphons, a lens ground to a curve, so earnest the margin had written patience beside it in a nun's hand. The opposite page bore a pastoral stamp, naming these drawings mirabilia, miracles of edification to be admired and not reproduced without proper authority. You can tell a forbidden device by what the vocabulary does to the verbs near it. Verbs that should sit with their sleeves rolled up fit, turn, grind, heat had been replaced with adore, contemplate, venerate, proceed. The catalogue had smothered invention with incense. I traced a siphon diagram with the shadow of my finger and felt heat where heat should not be. Not literal warmth remembered warmth. The page remembered being placed near a flame that had not yet learned to be a candle. A note in the bottom margin, written once and then written over itself by a feebler hand, read, "Transfer to reliquary when failure of replication is achieved." The instruction was clear. If you cannot bury a machine, canonize it. Tie a ribbon around its gears and let the public kiss what could have been a century earlier if allowed to clatter instead of chant. The lamp flame ticked. Tiny sounds thrive where truth is taught. I turned more pages, a rotating mirror meant to read sky the way a novice reads a psalm, slowly with love for error. A water clock that counted lunar breath instead of hours and so became a rumor instead of a tool. A diagram for a chariot of air that never left the ground because the materials were allocated to a reliquary that needed to be heavy enough to impress a visiting duke. Beside the chariot, a small, irritated hand had written, "Her name was Katerina. Stop calling her apprentice." I closed the book as if closing a window on a kind neighbor's quarrel. Some arguments you record by letting them keep speaking in the dark. What is the first exorcism? I asked the air, and Sister Gisela, who has never resisted the opportunity to turn a student question into a better one, said, "Of whom?" "Of us," I wanted to say. "Of the catalogue. Of the habit that mistakes deviation for sin and sin for a method of scheduling. Curiosity," I said. "We purge it from ourselves first, then from paper, then from rooms." She nodded with her mouth. "And the second?" "Plausibility," I answered, before I knew I'd thought it. "We exorcise the implausible by renaming it a miracle or a failure, whichever permission stamp we have most of this month. If I sound bitter, I am confessing poorly. The work has a music that can still make me reverent. Binding a cracked spine, washing a page in a bath with just enough calcium carbonate to return it from its thirst, sewing end bands to keep a head cap from going to pieces like a tired sentence. The hands learn a ethics the mind cannot always justify. And yet the chained Gospel of Thomas waited on the third lectern like a vow I had dodged. Its chain was shorter, its iron darker, its cover oak boards with skins turned hair in, puckered where some long-ago heat had convinced it to live crooked. The title was absent. Titles can be vanished, the tone cannot. From the first leaf I turned, I knew the book had not forgotten itself. You recognize stubbornness, the way you recognize your own gait at a distance. The text had been wounded where others were smoothed. Interlinear glosses bled into the main body, the way ivy pretends not to be strangling a wall. In places, entire lines had been scored with a knife and then inked over with a more churchly hand, as if to say, "This is what the sentence meant to mean." But under the new ink, the old stroke lifted like a bruise blossoming after a polite dinner. I angled the lamp down and lowered my head until the page's hair brushed my breath. Letters rose. Not letters you could comfortably quote to men who enjoy winning. Shapes. Intentions. The sentence remembered that it had once decided to say something the approving reader would not like, and then had been punished into promising to be more obedient. The promise had not held. I read aloud because some pages will not speak unless they hear a throat attempting their shapes. "If you bring forth what is within you," I murmured into the binding, the chain soft on the wood, "what you bring forth will save you." A simple sentence. Too simple. The margin twitched. "If you do not," I continued, "what you do not bring forth will destroy you." The lamp guttered and returned. The page made the small, satisfied sound you hear when an old man remembers the last line of a song and forgives himself for forgetting the first. "Who are you saving?" Sister Gisla asked, a question meant to keep a man from pretending he has only one audience. I did not answer. I turned 3 leaves and found the page that had made the room into a rumor. A parable that wanted to be practice. A set of steps, not liturgical, not even properly pious, for emptying a room of a voice that had mistaken the corner for a pulpit. Not dramatics. Housekeeping. Sweep east to west. Open the window not fully but to the width of a forefinger for airflow without invitation. Say nothing you would not say when happy. Then this was the line the censors had tried to cut with ceremony, and a confident pen leave food, not for the voice, for yourself, to remind the body it deserved to remain the room's landlord. Exorcism, the page had tried to teach, is not a duel but a lease agreement. The church had edited the metaphor into a sword. Swords photograph better. Behind me, a chain trembled. Not the books, the chain on the wall. A draft moved along the stones and made the iron touch itself with a shy kiss. I thought of Morello calling salt in wicks a confession, and felt that small, useful anger bloom again behind my ribs. You can love a house and refuse its methods. You can be loyal to the dust and accuse the feather dusters of lying. I wrote a note in my own small, steady hand. In the ledger, with the boring back. Thomas resists. Magdalene resists. Devices resist. Resistance catalogued as piety equals theft. I tore the page from the ledger and folded it and placed it under the chain of the gospel where it could press its thin insistence into iron. Mice prefer honesty. Let them carry it. There's a sound some books make when you're about to discover the sentence they've been protecting against the well-meaning. It is not a creak or a crackle. It is the inhalation of the glue along the spine, a thin, sticky sip that tells you the old animal is awake. The catalog of dissolved devices made it when I turned to the final section, which held no diagrams, only receipts, not metaphors. Actual receipts. lists of materials requisitioned for projects later baptized into reliquaries, 3 palms of copper wire repurposed for St. Cornelius's halo, 2 bundles of linen bandage redirected to the dressing of St. Veronica's veil, a cart of pitch denied to the chariot of air in favor of repairing torch mounts in the procession of the Epiphany. It went on for pages, and the totals told a story the committees never stamped. A century that could have flown chose to walk in a parade, and the parade thanked the century for its humility. "We didn't burn everything," Sister Gisela said. "That's what the surface world believes, that we are a great bonfire. But ash is a poor archivist. We prefer repurposing. It's tenderer and more effective. A machine hidden in a miracle is a machine delayed. Delay is a theology. Do you agree with it?" I asked. "Because there is a difference between explaining and excusing." She took a long time to answer. In that time I heard the ledger in the other room inhale once, quietly, as if doing me the courtesy of existing off stage. "I don't know how to agree with houses," she said. "I keep them. I ask questions inside them. Some nights I sleep in the broom closet because being near the tools makes it easier to forgive the mess. Some mornings I would throw open every hatch and let the public bring their own weather." She looked at the Gospel, at the seam in the Magdalene, at the catalogue whose diagrams had put on incense like a disguise. "I agree with paper," she said at last. "I believe it deserves the right to keep its bruises." That was when the room did something it had not done in my presence before. It answered, not with a voice, not with a theater of relics dripping or statues registering their objections with tears. It answered in the only grammar the tunnels trust: wait. The air around the third lectern grew denser by the pound. The chain, which had a moment ago seemed content to pretend it was only a symbol, tugged with the resolve of a dog who has remembered who taught him to heel. The gospel wanted to shut. Books do that, close themselves when the reader grows immodest with hunger. I placed my palm on the page and asked permission. This is not mysticism, it is manners. The page gave me one more paragraph. I cannot quote it. Not because it is forbidden, because my language has not learned how to be that honest without losing its teeth. It was not doctrine, it was inventory. Names of children whose mothers taught them to read by tracing letters on the backs of their hands during Mass. Names of women who smuggled soap into the baptistry so doubt could leave clean. Names of men who made bread with their hands and wanted those hands to touch the sentence that would make the bread unnecessary for a day. A ledger, in other words, that had mistaken itself for a gospel or the other way around. I closed the book. I bowed to it. I let the chain kiss the ring sewn on the board, and I did not apologize for the salt that had dried on my palm and left a print where a censor would later find it and call it vandalism. When I stepped back, the room thinned again, like a congregation that has agreed a sermon has concluded. The ledger in the other room held its breath. The lattice door signed its little waiver. I waited. Confessions require pauses. You can't hear the sin until the silence tells you which sentence wanted to occur and was stopped. You see why the first exorcism is us, Sister Gisela said, not as an indictment, but as a kindness. If we arrived at the page with all our praise and our cleverness, we would crowd out the voice that already has to shout, to be heard under the ceiling of obedience. I blew the lamp low and let the books re-enter their dignified darkness. We left the chained room as one leaves a sickbed where the patient has finally slept, on tiptoe, willing the hinges to practice discretion. Outside, the corridor's air was younger. Dust auditioned for shafts of light it would not get until afternoon. Morello's lantern left its honest lemon on the stones. I walked with my satchel heavier by a piece of paper I had not taken, and lighter by a feeling I had not earned. Permission to call theft by its most accurate name. Not burning, not banning, conversion. We converted knowledge into adoration so it could be taxed. We converted curiosity into ritual so it could be scheduled. We converted receipts into miracles so they could be counted as revenue instead of risk. I am not naive. The world above needs its steadiness. You cannot feed children with philosophies that haven't learned to put on shoes. But if you ask me what the ledger of fallen stars keeps that the catalog does not, I will answer this: the gravity of erasures. Not the ink that is gone, the weight left behind by what it carried. A blank is never empty. It is a bruise that has learned to hide its color. When the bells miscounted, a small stumble, not yet the 13th the ledger in the other room turned a page. I heard it the way a man hears his child in the next room turn in her sleep and knows the dream has changed. Soon, Sister Gisela said, and her voice finally betrayed fatigue. We'll have to decide whether to stamp a permission or refuse one. She looked at me with eyes that could have been my mother's if my mother had been a house with lungs. We always call that decision discernment, she said. It is often just appetite in a cassock. I wanted to tell her about the breathing map, and the inlet that had become a bay, and the cousin who would lend reluctantly, and therefore truly, but we keep some parables in our pocket until the room is ready to eat. I only said, "The map has been practicing." She understood more than I said. "Then so must you," she answered, and left me with the broom, which is to say, with priesthood. I swept. You cannot perform penance grandly here. You move dust from places that pretend not to value it to places that admit they do. You log. Your script is neat. You leave a line deep enough to scar the wood. You write down the little truths that survive the appetite of fathers and the patience of mothers and the salt in the wicks. You teach your lungs the difference between reading aloud and listening hard. And when a book refuses you, you thank it for the favor. It has saved a sentence for later. When you won't use it to flatter your courage, the corridor cooled around me. The chains relaxed. A mouse ran along the base of the wall with more ecclesiology in its tail than any parchment I have catalogued. Above, the polite doors of the basilica taught tourists how to rehearse a face called awe. Below, the books rehearsed their resistance until resistance became liturgy, and liturgy became a way for paper to keep its bruises in public without frightening the children. The ledger waited. Not yet had turned in its sleep and learned a new tense. I breathed with it, as I had with the map, 7 in, 7 out. A pause long enough for a sentence to remember what it meant before someone helped it mean better. I am telling you this so you will not accuse me later of having been surprised by what I opened. The books resisted. The margins glowed and hid. The devices wore incense like an arrest warrant. The gospel chained itself and still leaned toward the reader with the fearless friendliness of people who know they are telling the truth even if it will be filed under apocrypha. I did not free them. I learned to be read by them. And because I did, the ledger decided I might be trusted with what it had been holding in its salt, the catalog of what the world forgets on purpose. The 13th hour never arrives by force. It drifts in like a late guest who has rehearsed the apology so long it sounds like a blessing. That morning, after the map settled and the catalog remembered how to keep its bruises politely hidden, the basilica above performed daylight with expert cheer. Guides counted angels, cameras collected ceilings. Somewhere, a choir warmed vowels. Down here, we pretended the night had ended. It had not. It was merely catching its breath. Morello pressed a tin mug into my hand. The drink had the ambition of coffee and the humility of bread. "You'll want your lungs fat," he said. "Thin breath makes bad choices." He had slept a clerk's sleep, upright, guilty, strategic. I took the mug and tasted the metal and the honesty. "You hear it?" he asked. "Hear what?" I said, and the corridor answered for him the smallest, most courteous hitch in the air, as if a swallow had tried to carry a note too heavy for its throat. The basilica's great clock did not miscount. It hesitated. Hesitation is where the 13th hour finds its door. We can survive mistakes. The tunnels were built to swallow blunders and turn them into foundations. But hesitation willed. Hesitation makes a seam in time anyone with salt on his fingers can prize. I set the mug down. The warmth left a ring on the ledger stand. "It's early," I said. "It's ready," Morello answered, which is what men say when they mean we are not. The lattice to the chained room did not creak this time. It opened the way honest doors open, with a small clearance that feels like courtesy and is actually strategy. The gospel bowed its chain. The Magdalene kept its wound. The catalogue of dissolved devices imitated furniture. Beneath the front lectern lay the ledger, not breathing, not yet, but smoldering. The salt along its edge, bright as frost. I set my palm to the leather and did not get burned. The book had stopped saying, "Not yet." It had started saying, "Mind yourself." Sister Gisela appeared without her habit's hood, hair drawn tight as a rule that knows when to loosen. "If you open it," she said, "you'll have to accept entries in the order the book hands them. Don't hunt for your favorite doom. Doom that's hunted pretends to be bigger than it is." "I thought we believed in discernment," I said, "because courage in corridors often looks like quarrel in miniature." "We do," she replied. "Discernment is obedience practiced with eyes open." The basilica hesitated again. Somewhere above us, a tour shuffled, then held. I breathed as the map had taught me. 7 in, 7 out. A pause shaped like a child's cupped hand. The ledger answered by loosening the first stitch of its binding, a soft, almost obscene little kiss of glue letting go. I lifted the cover. There were no numerals on the first page. There were stars. Not drawings of stars, pressures of stars, as if a night sky had lain down on the vellum and left the memory of its cold. Constellations arranged themselves into arrangements you would not find in reputable atlases, and would recognize instantly if you had ever been a child counting freckles on your arm to decide what kind of day you were owed. The lines between the stars were not lines. They were intentions, faint tracks a thought makes when it knows where it would like to be remembered. In the top margin, a hand had written a legend of sorts, but the legend corrected you while you read it. Entries are dated by the sky's arithmetic. Translate only after the corridor consents. The script was neither ancient nor modern. It was the handwriting of rooms. I let my eyes adjust to the ledger's cadence. Some books want you to skim so they can accuse you later of ignorance. This one made you slow to the speed of ink drying The first entry resolved the way an image emerges in a dim photographer's tray, from shadow to admission. Entry: when the sky count was corrected. A winter is notarized that never happened in a city that will celebrate it anyway, because celebration is cheaper than correction. 3 constellations are erased from sea charts using a pious line, cloud. Fishermen call it luck, and then call it God, and then drink because both answers are expensive. A council of men press red wax into a decree that teaches mornings to arrive fractionally different for 40 years. The hungry sleep later, the careful die on time. We call it reform so the children won't cry when their birthdays move. I felt the pressure marks under the words, tiny braille made by the weight of stars pretending to be numbers. I translated as I had been taught. The winter corresponded to a range of years, the erased constellations to routes retired without funerals, the decree to a calendar that had inherited a century with bad posture. This is a joke, I said, but not because it was funny, because jokes are serious enough to survive the places men in collars pretend to forget. Don't be pious, Sister Gisla murmured. About what? About your outrage, she said. You're not the first to be hurt by arithmetic. I turned the page. The book obliged, with a slight stiffening, no volume opens freely until it decides you deserve the rest of the hinge. The second entry leaned closer, as if the ledger trusted me a fraction more than it had a minute ago. Entry: the feast that balanced a missing week. A city wakes to a liturgy invented to weigh against a gap. Processions are silvered so they look old in new eyes. Banners remember winds from other continents and pretend they belong to this street. A saint is minted overnight with a biography that complements the weather. Rain at first, then clearing, then a modest sunset. We do not ask people to forget. We give them something heavier to carry in the same hand. I watched a century settle into a festival, like a coin, taking the shape of a purse. The ledger did not blame, it counted. Counting is crueler and kinder than accusing. The third entry refused me, not with theater, with weight. The page will not turn when it knows you want it for the wrong reason. What's the wrong reason? I asked. Not sure I wanted the answer. Vindication, said Sister Gisla. It makes men cruel. It makes committees worse. The corridor held its breath. And then the basilica did not miscount. It added, a soft, deliberate strike that no one upstairs would log because minutes prefer round numbers. The ledger opened like a room whose occupant has looked through the peephole and decided you are the version of you that can be trusted. Entry: the false Lent. Famine is expensive to acknowledge, so we name virtue instead. 40 days are borrowed from the poor and lent to the rich as a moral they can afford. Preachers caution against gluttony while cooks discover cleverness with little. A scribe invents a fast that did not happen because his master cannot afford to be seen eating. Children learn to count to 40 in a voice that will later be hired by the state. At the end, a saint is thanked for interceding with a stomach that had already decided to stop growling. The calendar remains grateful ever after. I closed my eyes and saw the breathing map exhale into that entry, a province where nothing changed except the story, and therefore everything changed that a story can reach. The ledger did not preach. It tallied how permission disguises itself as piety when time needs to be laundered. Morello hovered at the door, hat in hand the way men hold their hats in rooms where they trust the upholstery and not the hosts. "If you must," he said, meaning do not. I kept reading. Entry. The appointment of a day that cannot exist. 2 calendars quarrel and produce a child. He is taught to live between midnights. The ledgers upstairs record him as inventory. Candles, wine, a new lock, a rumor. He grows up to be a bridge. Others cross without knowing he is a person. He is dismantled after his usefulness concludes, and his parts are blessed separately so no one feels the loss. "Leap years," I said. "Leap men," Sister Gisela corrected. "We built them too. It is easier to skip a man than a day." I turned the page and the ledger hissed not with anger, with glue parting, the little mercy sound paper makes, when it allows you a truth it had been saving. The entry that followed was pressed deeper than the rest. Someone had written it with the stylus you use when you want a word to survive even after knives. Entry. The name removed to save the season. A woman taught children to count the hours by the tilt of their shadows, then suggested that the church bells should follow the children. The suggestion made a nobleman late to his theater. He petitioned. She became unnamed. The bells returned to obeying curtains instead of Sunday. The petition survives in the archive under an improvement of manners. I put my hand flat on the page. The ledger warmed as if embarrassed. "This isn't history," I said. "It's biography practiced on the cosmos." "Cosmos is just a city that hasn't learned humility," Sister Gisela said. "Turn." The basilica coughed its apologetic extra chime, and the room's corners became accurate. Stone corners. When the 13th arrives, reveal what they've been doing with your assumptions. The geometry changed from friendly to true. The ledger's stars rearranged themselves in the head of the page, and the ink listened to its own blood. Entry. Correction of sky counting for the sake of war. Armies are more obedient than weather. Move a campaign a week forward and call the dawn righteous. A battle is blessed because the fog arrived on time. A letter travels faster because messengers are told yesterday is farther away than it is. A saint collects the victory with modest reluctance. The dead collect their due with perfect punctuality. "Stamp?" Morello asked, half in jest, half in fright, because stamping permissions is the liturgy of men who fear silence more than error. "We stamp nothing," Sister Gisela said, using my earlier lesson against my impatience. "Let the ledger cast. Let the map choreograph. We will find the date when the child carves it into stone." The ledger turned a page by itself. That happens sometimes when the 13th hour is pleased with your manners. The next entry made my teeth forget which century they preferred. Entry. The year of the answered question. A scholar asked, how many days fit between 2 inventions? 2 answers presented themselves. One was tidy and would fund a festival. One was ugly and would feed a city. The clean answer is stamped and sung. The ugly answer is bound in leather and lent to men who will not confess they read it. The city starves politely. The festival survives. I thought of the catalog's receipts. Copper wire to halos, pitch to torches, time days smelted into songs that could be taxed. I was not a better man for understanding. I was a man who had run his fingers along a seam and found the stitch that held my patience together. "Why stars?" I asked. "Why not numbers like everyone else?" "Because numbers invite arithmetic," Sister Gisela said. "Stars invite stories. Arithmetic risks proof. Stories risk company. Then in dispute of the part en del remendov, The ledger grew heavier under my palm as if agreeing. I tried another page, and the book resisted for a different reason, not because I was unworthy, but because it was. The entry had been written over, then scraped, then written again in a smaller, shamefaced hand. Entry: the Jubilee that repaired a theft. A century is announced as a kindness to wipe away the arithmetic of debt. People cross bridges and call the walk forgiveness. A coin is blessed with a saint's profile and spends more obediently. A mathematician points out the remainder that will break chairs in 30 years. He is invited to a dinner and given a seat near a window where the draft will make him quiet. The remainder survives. Chairs break on schedule. We call them antiques. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because my breath needed a door. The ledger, irritated by my impertinence, lightened, as if threatening to be less interesting if I became glib. "Forgive me," I said to paper, and meant it. I was taught badly how to be angry. "Anger is a solvent," Sister Gisla said. "Use it on glue, not on people." The Basilica's hesitation sharpened into the clean addition that makes the 13th hour official down here. It is not the count itself, it is the corridor's agreement to call it a count. Lamps leaned toward their own wicks. Chains discovered their weight. Ink remembered water. Time, obedient, edited, taxed time showed its hem. The ledger stopped needing my consent. It opened with the old animal's confidence and offered the entry I had felt under my skull since the first not yet. Entry: the night the candles bled salt. The wicks confess on behalf of men who won't. Salt remembers absences and borrows tongues from the obedient. A librarian places contraband on his mouth and mistakes taste for courage. The corridors decide he may be corrected upward. The ledger turns. A map inhales so a bay may exist for a cousin's reluctance. A woman whose machines would have flown is softened into incense. A ritual asks for a refusal, so theology can pretend to love consent. The refusal is entered as a weather event, clear, with pockets of hunger. The book warms a palm because hands will trust heat when they cannot trust grammar. I did not cry. I am not a man who cries in front of paper, but the breath I took had the grammar of a sob. Gisla put 2 fingers on the lower margin, as if preventing the page from becoming too true. "It is not clairvoyance," she said softly, anticipating the superstition forming in me. "It is accounting. The 13th hour balances ledgers that daylight pretends don't exist. The book knew your shape because rooms learn the footsteps of men who will eventually disobey politely. Is there a page for the aftermath?" I asked. "For the cost?" "All aftermaths are marginalia," she said. "We write them in the boring books upstairs, and mice decide which parts deserve to be scripture." The ledger rolled forward like a tide. I did not hold it. I had learned by now that paper likes to make the first move. Entry: the city that misplaced a sunrise. For a week, clocks are obedient to curtains. Bakers look out their windows and decide to be late or to be heretics. A child notices that the birds have learned to sing in a different key. He tells his mother, who tells the woman at the fountain, who tells a priest, who tells a man with a stamp. The man stamps the child into anecdote and the birds into metaphor. The sunrise arrives where it was scheduled. The child learns not to ask birds for the time. I turned a page, greedy, and the ledger punished me with an entry so small I almost missed it. tucked like a needle behind a hem. Entry. A name spelled once correctly. A mapmaker writes a coastline as it is, and not as the committee prefers. His name is spelled correctly in a ledger no one reads. He dies later than expected and is buried on the wrong day. The sea remembers him. The committee learns to pronounce his surname when his grandson is useful. Who writes these? I asked. Because someone must, even if the someone is a room. Rooms do, Gisela said, and men who have learned to write like rooms, and women who have learned to write like weather, and children who have not learned yet to write like money. And once in a while, a saint. You speak as if saints exist. They do, she said. They are people whose ledgers balance in an ugly key that the committees cannot sing. The basilica hummed its extra note again, stronger, less embarrassed. The 13th had arrived fully now. If you have not stood inside a hesitation turned to duration, you have not felt the peculiar honesty of rooms that are tired of pretending they were built only for one kind of mourning. The ledger took the opportunity to open its middle, the signature of any book, the place bindings confess, by Crackle. Entry. The year we forgot not to forget. A city keeps 2 calendars on purpose, for a season, to learn how to disobey gracefully. Shopkeepers write both dates on receipts. Lovers postpone their arguments by switching calendars at the door. Soldiers learn to desert at noon in one system and return at dusk in the other. At the end, the city is told it has been wicked, and it nods, relieved to be scolded for a joy it cannot quite name. The ledgers balance, the baker sleeps, the birds keep their key. I looked up. Morello was standing with his hat crushed, his eyes wet in the way men who never cry choose at last to become human. I was a baker's son, he said, as if confiding a crime. What did you bake? I asked, gently, because men deserve, at least once, to name the thing they carried out of ovens when the city needed proof time could be eaten. Bread, he said, pitying himself for the smallness of the word. But on the days when the bells miscounted, we called it forgiveness. The ledger cooled. The 13th hour had begun to tire. Rooms cannot hold their honesty forever. They need to return to furniture. I put my palm to the page and asked for the first time to see ahead. Not prophecy, cost. The ledger will sometimes allow it if the question is humble. Entry. Payment schedule for an adjustment rendered. A librarian will lose his suffix and keep his profession. He will be assigned candles that behave, corridors that do not breathe, books that sleep like children who have been bribed with sweets. He will learn the taste of exile and call it diet. He will refuse one ritual and be rewarded with another, the ritual of speaking aloud in rooms that were designed for whispers. The ledger will enter this as maintenance. The saints will enter it as finally. I closed the book. The glue resealed with a grateful, tired smack. The salt along the edges loosened its brightness into the dull of ordinary crystals. The room exhaled. The basilica above returned to its respectable arithmetic. The 13th hour folded its apology into a pocket where later, if asked, it could pretend never to have existed. Sister Gisela drew a long, measured breath, and then another, the way a midwife breathes after a child is born, and the room has not yet decided whether to remember the screaming. You will be tempted, she said, to make a sermon out of this. I am not a preacher, I said. No, she said. You are worse. You are an accountant who has learned to love metaphors. Promise me something. What? Days. Not visit. When you speak about the 13th, keep the verbs small. She tapped the ledger with 2 fingers, fond and stern. We adjusted. We stamped. We counted. We named. We forgot. We remembered. Anything larger turns this into theater. It is not theater. It is custody. Morello found the courage to be ordinary. "Shall I log it?" he asked, and the comfort of his question was a blanket. I nodded. He wrote in the boring book with the back mice adore, unscheduled addition to the hour, ledger consulted, corrections observed, no stamp applied, pending the arrival of the child who will write the date on stone. I lifted the ledger and felt, briefly, the weight of a night sky pretending to be a number system. "May I?" I began, meaning keep. "No," the room said, through Sister Gisla's mouth, "but you may carry the smell." She smiled. "Books travel better by scent than by citation." We left the chained room. The lattice closed with a sound that forgave us for leaving at all. The corridor broadened back into politeness. Dust learned its old choreography. The map, somewhere in its hatch, let out one last respectful breath, like a curtain exhaling after applause. I climbed a dozen steps toward the light and stopped, because stopping is a craft. I turned back to the dark and told it, as if it were a person. "I will speak in small verbs." It felt like betrayal to go upstairs and look at the sun without counting. I did it anyway. You cannot curate a house if you forget that the world outside also breathes on a schedule it refuses to admit. Tourists were already angling their phones to steal a piece of sky with a ceiling printed on it. A child asked his mother if angels have ankles. A guide lied gently about the age of a door. I bought a heel of bread from a vendor who kept 2 watches, one accurate, one handsome. I ate it and tasted a century that had learned to chew. Later minutes or years, the distinction was playing with me. I returned to the stand and wrote my entry so plainly a mouse might frame it and hang it in a nest. The hour added 1. The ledger opened. We saw how a winter could be notarized into obedience, how a feast could balance a week that was missing its courage, how arithmetic and appetite share a desk. We stamped nothing. We listened. We promised each other to keep verbs unambitious. And yet I confess this. I want the ledger to open again. I signed with my suffix, out of habit, then crossed it out of honesty. The ink dried with the satisfaction of a page that has decided to tell the truth only once today. I breathed. The corridor matched me. Somewhere behind a lattice, salt remembered its job. Somewhere under a hatch, the map rehearsed a lung. Somewhere in the ledger, a star adjusted itself a fraction and waited for a child to turn it into a date. If you have stayed with me through these small verbs, you deserve a magician. I don't have one. I have a debt. The 13th hour opens like a soft mouth. It does not bite. It reminds. We who stamp and sew and sweep, we who exercise our curiosity until it returns as duty, we are not the keepers of truth. We are its clerks. And yet on nights like this one, with salt on my tongue and a ledger's constellation behind my eyes, I allow myself the impertinence of a prayer I do not speak aloud. Let memory come back. Let it come back like breath. Let it come back in verbs no larger than a child's hand. You do not notice the watchers until you've trained your eyes to stop seeking faces. Faces are easy. They offer the mercy of symmetry. Watchers live where symmetry is an accident, in the chipped corner of a step that never learned to heal, in the crack that refused the plasterer's apology, in the shadow stitched to a hinge like a small attentive dog. The first time I admitted their company, I was cataloging a processional register, a long ledger bound in convent blue cloth, its pages ruled with decisive ink, columns for names, trades, parishes, columns for banners, relics, distances walked, songs assigned, and in 3 middle columns that should have been modestly blank between seasons, there was fog, not emptiness, fog. When my breath touched those columns, a surname surfaced: Vasari, Vassallo, and dissolved when I blinked. Morello, who has never cultivated a taste for metaphor, said quietly, "They pool where remembering is taxed." He pressed his thumb to the margin. The fog gathered to his thumb, a trick of humidity and superstition, and we saw, briefly, a row of children's names that had been filed under a saint they were forbidden to invoke later in life. "Watchers keep columns like this tidy," he added. "They dislike sprawl. Memory is a hallway to them. They enforce fire code. The Briesen sprand, Virsen. The watchers are not angels. Angels, in paintings, move in the direction men admire. Watchers move where edits require." At the mouth of the corridor called the organ's throat, a long, narrow tube of stone that breathes drafts into the choir loft, someone had once painted saints. Their eyes had been scratched down to polite ovals, not in hatred, but in that bureaucratic tenderness that replaces a name with a title. In the second oval from the left I saw, for a moment, not eyes returning my look, but the flat attention of a proofreader. The feeling was not accusation. It was grammar. The watcher, behind the paint, was waiting for my sentence to declare its subject before it allowed me a verb. "Don't address them," Sister Gisla said when she noticed my silence taking the shape of a prayer. "They file complaints. What do they want?" I asked. "Less personality," she said. "More compliance. Think of them as marginal notes the house leaves for itself." We moved past them to the room of minutes, which is what we call the chamber where committees store their perfectances and their regrets. The air there tasted like iron beeswax and the inside of a good coat. On a slanted desk lay what looked like an itinerary, the program of a crusade. It had dates, staging points, routes mapped with arrows so elegant you could hear silk. In the margin, a hand had written procession, and then struck it through, then rewritten it, slower, as if the hand had been shamed by its own honesty. The invented crusade never marched the way songs say. Men bled for it. That much is true. But the war was largely a sound. Relics moved from city to city in precise arcs. Libraries shifted shelves. Charters crossed borders wrapped in banners, and a column of officials learned to pronounce the names of towns as if they had slept there. The logistics were beautiful. Beauty is a treacherous ledger. It balances itself by taxing whatever cannot be made photogenic. A brass compass lay on the desk, its needle frozen, its face etched with the cardinal points. North had been filed off a clean, surgical absence. In its place was a single word: obedience. I lifted the compass. It did not spin, it listened. Directions are indecent in rooms where movement is preordained. "We used to keep this in the case upstairs," Gisla murmured. "Too many noses to the glass." It fogged. We brought it down to breathe. Now and then it tells us when a procession will decide to become a pilgrimage. That's when the watchers get cross. The watchers enforce memory the way a strict usher enforces seating. They prefer families to sit where the ticket says they belong. They approve applause where scheduled. But there are always the latecomers, the days that arrive without invitation and insist on being counted, the names that re-enter a register via weddings and deaths, the saints that men whisper to because the official saint has learned how to be deaf. The watchers do not punish. They submit red lines. The house adopts most of them because red ink makes fear appear tidy. In a shallow drawer, I found thin wooden boards, each with a leather thong and a small metal plate riveted to its edge. Masks for statues. The faces painted on them were generic, compliant, a saint face produced by a workshop that had optimized virtue for speed. Beneath each mask, a card, whose statue it had covered, for how long, and why. Worn by Saint Marina during the Great Inventory. Worn by an unknown bishop during the reassignment of eyes. A note at the bottom of one card read, "Returned with gratitude. Original countenance stripped of distractions." The watchers write that word distractions when they mean particularity. A particular face invites remembrance. Memory hinders edits. The masks help the house remove friction. False popes, Morello said under his breath, when we came to a cupboard of parchments titled by year, not by man. He meant not impostors wearing rings, but eras enthroned. In certain decades, the chair itself was pope. It adopted men to fill a shape. Documents of those years carried a tone like a tuning fork held too long. "We've been told to use their regnal names," I said, ashamed of the docility in my training. "We should have written administration of obedience, duration unspecified." "Write that when you leave," Gisela said. "Up here, verbs must remain small." She touched the cupboard door. Open. Inside, lists of permits to remember. Families applying to keep a name on a scan of wall after a purge of saints. Guilds petitioning to continue telling a story about a miracle that kept men honest at a bridge. Each permit carried red margins where the watchers had proposed edits. Replace miracle with safety. Replace Saint Jerome with neighbor. Replace weeping with condensation. The families had countersigned many of these corrections with resigned bones in the ink. X's taught at kitchen tables. Back at the processional register, the fog columns began to condense, as if the 13th hour remembered it had left some moisture in the paper and wanted it back. Names surfaced and softened. A girl named Agata stood for a moment in a row that would have marched her beneath a banner of the Virgin. Then she melted into the margins because someone had decided her husband's name was more efficient for the parish. A boy named Isidoro had 2 birthdays and no baptism until a crusade passed by, and a priest, for convenience, made a font out of the shadow of a banner. The watchers love conveniences. They make edits behave like kindness. I took the register to a side desk and fetched a copied stamp I am not permitted to possess. A little iron tool shaped like a question mark. It leaves a punctum in the margin, a legal way to say, "We observed," without the nuisance of, "We object." Archivists learn to prefer puncta because objections require signatures, and signatures make enemies. I placed a punctum beside each fog line that let me see a name long enough to pity it. A peppering of punctuation cannot save a city, but it can embarrass a committee. Embarrassment is the next most useful solvent after anger. "You see them?" Gisela asked. "The watchers? The substitutions." She lowered her face to the register until her breath almost touched the page. Where a name gives way to a title, where a feast gives way to a policy, where a face gives way to a stencil. She closed her eyes as if listening to a choir just beyond a door. Memory keeps its receipts. We keep the drawer unlocked for an hour. Then we pretend we never did. We took the compass without north to the corridor. It hummed slightly in my palm, a polite vibration, like a cat purring in deference to the furniture. At the junction called the throat's mouth, the needle turned not to a direction, but to a procedure. The watchers were near. You feel them the way you feel grammar, first as a correction, then as a limit, finally as a familiarity you cannot name without becoming lonely for the terrible kindness of imprecision. They submitted their edits in the oldest way, by moving air. A draft raised a thin tide of dust along the base of a wall and revealed writing where no ink had been. Narrow the story. Another draft. Remove the child. Another. Permit grief. Disallow grievance. They're civil tonight, Morello said, with that gallows cheerfulness bakers acquire in cities that tithe sleep. Once they wrote, replace hunger with fasting. We were cross for a month. I set the compass on the floor. Its needle turned to a door whose lock I had never learned. We entered a depository of lists: births, deaths, marriages, confiscations. Confiscations returned. On the high shelf lay a coil of rope knotted at intervals, each knot tagged with a tiny tin medal. Rosary of the City. One medal read flood, one read fire, one read memory. The rope had been shortened. I could see where fiber had been cut and retied. They had removed famine and replaced it with abstinence. The rope looked proud of its new diet. The watchers had filed the receipt. Substitution, achieved without public distress. False popes, I said again, and this time I understood. When a period is enthroned, all lists follow its face. The city's rosary must be adjusted to flatter a decade's piety. The decade becomes a person, the way a statue becomes a saint, because a seamstress cannot afford to lie to herself while sewing eyes on a mask. How did the invented crusade feel? I asked, because the ledgers capture cost, but feeling is how future costs decide whether to occur. Like a well-rehearsed funeral where the dead man is home eating soup, Gisela said. We cried beautifully. We kissed banners until our lips learned a piety of cloth. The libraries moved without bumping the corners because the procession taught the corners to make way. When I was a novice, I thought I was lifting relics. I was lifting card catalogs with incense in their pockets. Did anyone resist? Everyone, she said, but only in the way the house allows. We kept things instead of keeping quiet. A book falls from a cart. A register arrives late. A saint's mask is returned with two faces painted inside, so the next volunteer has to choose which face to lie with. The watchers file these as accidents. She smiled, not for joy. Accidents keep the building honest about being a place where humans once worked. The compass nudged my ankle like a good dog, insisting we move. It dragged us to a narrow passage lined with drawers labeled errata, corrections, emendations, reforms, retractions, reassignments, bookkeeping, Morello muttered, sentimental for language that tells the truth politely. Near the floor, a small drawer bore no label. I opened it. Inside, a single sheet of paper, folded, coarse, unfolded, a prayer. Let the watchers rest. Let them sit in a pew built for people who bruise. Let them see a face and not a template. Let them learn a mistake so precise it becomes a relic we carry to keep humility heavy. Let them love a child's misspelling more than a committee's calligraphy. Let them leave a door unlocked because stories are poor swimmers and need air. There was no signature. We found that after the last inventory, Gisla said. We keep it here because prayers don't belong in liturgy until they've done their apprenticeship as petitions. The invented Crusades itinerary had carried, at intervals, small notches, places to pause for redistribution. The register called them restorations. The drawers here called them reallocations. We located one in the drawer, marked reassignments, a list of monasteries instructed to exchange their maps under cover of midnight vespers. When a war wants to move the future, it first moves the past safely, I said aloud, surprised by the evenness in my own tone. We are very good at safety, Morello said. We spend so much courage on safety we have none left for honesty. On the far wall, a set of 8 small frames hung in a tidy row, portraits of nobody. Each frame contained a fragment of a profile chin, brow, ear, nose, cheek, rendered with exquisite care in silver point. Together they might have assembled a face capable of blessing a decade. Separately, they were useless. A brass plate beneath the row, composite of a rain. I put my hand against the frame with the ear. Listening was the caption written in a hand I recognized, the modest arrogance of the man who had taught me to salt wicks, speaking under the mouth, hesitation under the brow, stamp under the nose. North was missing. Who drew them? I asked. A child with access to the wrong paper, Gisla said. We gave her a broom and kept the drawings. Later, a decade borrowed her face without asking. That's how rains work. They borrow faces until nobody minds returning their own. We returned the compass to the desk and the processional register to its shelf. The fog obeyed the watchers and lay down like a proper blank. Before it settled, I took a pin and made one small hole at the edge of the fog column, small enough to pass for an accident, large enough to let air remember a name when the 13th returns. Punctum? Gisla asked. Lung, I said. In the hall of stencils we found the stencils for official expressions: astonishment, piety, bereavement, gratitude. Under gratitude, someone had penciled forgiveness and then rubbed it out so hard the paper's tooth had been abraded. We tried the stencils one on another like children breaking rules respectfully. Astonishment fit perfectly over piety. Bereavement made a handsome mask for correction. This is how the watchers save money, Morello said, equal parts admiration and disgust. They reuse faces. Back in the corridor, the air moved with the edited patience of a room returning to furniture. The compass fell still. The watchers, if they had been near, had filed their red lines and walked their halls. I thought of the rosary of the city, shortened to please a decade, the masks with eyes you could wear over any saint without guilt, the frames of the composite of a rain, the fog that preferred to be a hallway rather than a weather report. I thought of the ledger's entry for the false Lent, how hunger had been hired to impersonate virtue until everyone agreed to go to bed early together. Do you hate them? I asked Gisla. She took a very long time. I hate fatigue, she said finally. Watchers are the body's fatigue turned into policy. They appear when stories are too tired to argue for themselves. We should feed the stories. We file the watchers. What feeds a story? Particularity, she said without hesitation. A name used correctly in a kitchen. A child's wrong note that makes the choir confess they were singing by habit. A date carved by a mason with dirty hands, who forgot the committee's preference and wrote what his lunch told him. She looked toward the chained room, as if it were a person who might hear praise and not be ruined by it. And mercy, will the ledger record this? I asked, meaning the fog columns, the compass with no north, the invented Crusades itinerary that had never learned to sweat. It will, she said, but not as outrage, as inventory. We are not prophets, we are clerks. Prophets burn too much paper. We sat on the stair that is never counted, the small landing between the organ's throat and the hall of stencils. Morello shared a heel of bread that tasted like a week, good enough to be remembered, mild enough to be taxed. When the crusade passed my street, he said, I was a boy. We hung little lanterns from the bakery awning. My mother cried quietly at the sight of so much order. She said it made her feel safe. Was she? I asked. Yes, he said. And no. The bread sold. The city slept. The library lost 3 shelves. We kept the lantern, he shrugged. Safety is a ledger. It balances. It never satisfies hunger. The corridor cooled again in that respectful way it has when the house prepares the last rehearsal before daylight. The watchers retract. Their grammar remains. You feel it after they go. The compulsion to put names in boxes, to make kindness fit a field, to keep grief without grievance. I put my palm to the wall where the fog had shown its shy names and said a small literal sentence, one the house could not file as metaphor. Agata walked. The stone warmed. Isidoro sang off-key. A tiny draft passed. The lantern was blue. The fog did not return, but the air had learned to be less tidy for a moment. We parted. Morello to his lantern's discipline, Gisla to her hatches and her disobedient map. I to the lattice where the ledger sleeps. Before I went in, I stood at the cupboard of false popes, the enthroned periods, the decades that borrowed faces, and I did a vulgar thing. I took a year and held it in my hand like a warm fruit. 1,312. It fit a palm. It smelled like smoke and oranges. I put it back. You're not a thief, Gisla had said earlier. You're a clerk who has learned to confess. The ledger greeted me with the indifference of a patient who has decided the doctor may as well return, since everyone has decided together that health will be measured in small verbs. I did not open it. I sat near it, and I waited for the house to sigh. From somewhere, the register, the rosary, the compasses, the frame's tiny noises rose, not dramatic, not accusatory. They were the sounds paper makes when it adjusts to temperature and decides to survive. The watchers, I imagined, were standing together in a high corridor where dust gathers like officials, submitting the last red lines. Narrow the story. Remove the child. Permit grief. Disallow grievance. Perhaps one of them, tired, imprecise from a long night, dropped a note that read, Remember. Perhaps it fell near my shoe. I picked up nothing. I wrote nothing. I practiced the only exorcism I believe in. I stayed. Memory does not return because we summon it with beautiful sentences. It returns because someone refuses to leave the room while it gathers itself. Down here, we practice refusal kindly. We put our hands on the table until it is time to lift them. We give our lungs small, durable orders. We keep verbs small so they can fit through the cracks. Watchers leave when they are too tired to be clever. We breathe a city's rosary back to its original length, and then we let it shorten again because the house must sleep. We leave a pinhole in the fog. The 13th hour had retired. The basilica reheated its arithmetic. I lay my hand on the ledger and felt not yet, not now, but soon a word that has learned not to overpromise. It vibrated through the leather like a rumor that has put on boots. Upstairs, a guide rehearsed the sentence about angels and architecture. Down here, the watchers went off duty and left their grammar in the walls, where it would do its sweet, necessary harm until the next time a door forgot to lock itself. I rose to go. At the door I stopped and turned back, because I have learned that rooms forgive departures only if you look at them as if they were people who will miss you. I will bring small verbs, I said. I will label the fog without claiming to see through it. I will not hate the usher for enforcing seating in a theater built to be a church. I will ask for names in kitchens and accept years like fruit. The room allowed the courtesy with a softness in the air that might have been a draft and might have been a yes. In the stairwell, the compass with no north had turned itself to face the outside world as if requesting parole. I left it where it was. Outside, the city had already begun the day's procession. Bicycles, pigeons, paper cups. Somewhere, a child was asking what year it is. Somewhere, a baker was deciding what to call bread. Somewhere, a librarian was learning that mice respect sentences that refuse to flatter courage. The watchers would file their edits. The committees would stamp. The map would breathe. The ledger would open again. And when it does, I will be here with a broom, with a heel of bread, with a punctum, with a pinhole, practicing the exhausting, beautiful custodianship of letting memory come back at the speed of air. I was invited to officiate the ritual of deletion, the way a man is invited to his own retirement, with compliments that sound like flowers pressed flat between encyclopedia pages. The summons was a small card, thick as a tooth, edged with ink that had been blued by age on purpose. No signature, just the sigil pressed so deep you could read it with your palm. A halo broken into 7 points, the same emblem that had tagged receipts, stamped permissions, and whispered itself into the corners of corrections until the building spoke it without knowing. There is a corridor you only learn by disobedience. It runs behind the stair of inventories and below the choir's concealed footing, and its stones are the color of regret kept in good order. I took it because the polite hall would have made me a better man than the ceremony deserved. The air smelled of wood, ancient boards that had kept their ship breath after being hired as furniture. At the end of the corridor, a door the size of a confession. Iron, with a mouth the shape of a keyhole that had learned to admire itself. Inside, the chamber was smaller than fear and larger than appetite. The walls had been paneled with timbers salvaged from hulls that had carried libraries out of cities during emergencies that were renamed festivals. At the center stood a lectern of black wood veneered with boat plank scars, a geography of currents and barnacles that even the pious would have called honest. Around it, a circle large enough for 12 people who had learned to stand in a way that suggested humility and practiced superiority. On the far wall, the proximity of a door that looked like an exit and was not. They had already arranged the tools. Salt in a shallow dish, white as sleep. Candles trimmed to pious heights, their wicks combed to repent. A bowl of water so sincerely still it felt like a lie. Water prefers movement. A small silver hammer that had learned to look innocent while striking. And the book, a tome with a face of dull leather, mottled the color of dried leaves, bound with a strap too short to fasten unless the book agreed. I had never seen this one in circulation. Some volumes are brought to ceremonies the way some relatives appear only at weddings and wills. The ritual master wore no vestments. Rituals that plan to be believed avoid costumes. He was a tidy man with hands that had only learned lunch as a concept. His sentences would, I knew, prefer the passive. "Welcome," he said, as if I had asked to be there. "We require a witness to refuse." He said it with the gentle malice of a teacher assigning the child with the cleanest handwriting to copy punishments on the chalkboard. "Why me?" I asked, to save time. Because the room had already decided. "You read," he said, "and you return what you read to the world in sentences that do not embarrass us. Refusal must be credible to work." The others arrived without accident. Sister Gisla with her hair pinned down like a law that has agreed to behave. Morello with his hat in his hands, dressed as a custodian who forgot to stop being a baker's son. 3 officials in nice wool. 2 scholars with lungs trained for size. A young woman whose eyes had not learned to praise efficiency. And an old priest whose gentleness had been mistaken for compliance long enough that he had learned to use the mistake. We took our places around the lectern, the way people take places around a patient, hiding our love in the practical arrangement of tools. The master placed a sheet on the lectern. It did not carry a name at first. Rituals prefer to establish their choreography before they ask you to believe, but you could feel a name-shaped gravity puckering the air above it. The salt shivered, remembering sea. The candles performed their obedience. "We begin," the master said. And we began. The ritual of deletion is not magic. It is accounting practiced with dramaturgy, so the arithmetic will feel like morality. We circled the lectern 12 times forward, naming virtues in a language arranged to embarrass verbs: patience, obedience, sobriety, charity, all the good furniture. Then once backward, naming a fear in ours: hunger, fire, ridicule, being wrong in public. My fear, when it came to me, surprised me with its tidiness. Not being useful. The room took it down in its ledger like a doctor noting an allergy he had predicted. Candles are salted to remember the shape of what will be absent. The master pinched a little onto each wick with the dexterity of a man who has learned to love precision instead of mercy. The wax accepted the crystals as if returning an old favor. "Read," he said to me, and for a second I almost asked what. Then the name arrived. It arrived not in letters but in pressure, a heaviness of syllables on the page that contracted the skin along my forearms as if cold had asked for hospitality. A scientist, a woman, the one whose machines would have flown if wires had not learned how to become halos. Her name is not important for you to hear now, not because it is secret, but because secrecy would flatter the ritual I am trying to undress. Her name was there. She was there. A line drawn across the page, the way roads draw themselves across countries that have not asked to be highways. "Read," the master said again, and this time he meant translate. I read her into the room. I read her into a story that had learned to live without her. I read her into the faces around the circle, until the circle became a clock and the hour would not move unless her name was allowed to hold the minute hand. The room tightened. The door that was not an exit learned to flatter my eyes with the posture of help. "Refuse," the master said, and put the silver hammer in my hand. Refusal is built into the ritual, the way a token concession is built into a counterfeit negotiation. One person must refuse the deletion, so that the deletion can declare itself consensual. It is the lever by which guilt moves the house without cracking its plaster. I raised the hammer and did not strike. No, I said. The candles leaned their flame toward the lectern, eager as children hoping to be praised for memorization. The master's eyes, to his credit, did not flinch. "State your grounds," he said. "She is a receipt," I answered. "The city has already spent her on masks, on processions, on comfort, and written off the remainder as an antique. We do not delete receipts, we audit them." "This calms, say, poetry," one scholar murmured, with the dull terror of a man who fears metaphor because it knows his address. "Procedure," I said. "We are not prophets, we are clerks. Our verbs must remain small, or they will not fit through the cracks. Watchers leave when they are tired." The master considered, a courtesy he offered to make refusal feel as if it does work. "Noted," he said, "and then proceed." The ritual continued. The silver hammer touched the page around the name, never on it, striking the whites between letters in 13 places, marked invisible by custom. In each struck place, the paper forgot how to press into the world. The name remained legible, but lost its weight. It could be read, it could be quoted, it could not bruise. That is the aim. Names without pressure. Facts without gravity. Memory that sticks to tongues but cannot crack a tooth. The room softened as the letters lightened, a kind of politeness descending, the relief of furniture when a heavy guest stands up and turns into a story. We repeated the circle. The master spoke the words that teach smoke to write an S-curve above a saint. The candles obeyed, their salted tears catching the draft and tracing a line that the room had been trained to call release. After the 7th night, the manual said, the letters would stop indenting. Tonight was the first. The page had done its duty. The house congratulated itself on the moral efficiency of conversion. A person turned into a lesson turned into a relic turned into a reason to keep buying candles. "Next name," the master said. I felt a hand at my sleeve. Morello, whose fingers had learned to carry heat and not burn, tugged. His eyes were wet without shame. "Let it be me," he whispered. "I've always wanted to know what it feels like to be a century." I closed my hand over his. "You already are," I said, "because bread is a calendar, and men who have fed cities carry more years in their wrists than committees will put on chairs." The next name arrived, a map-maker, the one whose west is not our west because he had refused, one day, to obey the courtesy of a compass whose north had been replaced by obedience. We circled, we salted, we raised the hammer. "Refuse," the master said. And again I said no. This time the young woman beside me said it with me, her voice still stiff from learning verbs too carefully. The old priest smiled, like a man who has watched winters regionalized into feasts and has decided to believe in lists more than in predictions. "Add a punctum," he suggested mildly. "The margin prefers records of what we were almost brave enough to do. We put the hammer down. We perform the politeness that makes rooms feel in charge. And then the ritual decided to show us the face it keeps for days when witnesses believe the refusal matters. The door that is not an exit unlatched itself. It opened onto a corridor I did not know, which is the only corridor I ever truly trust. Cold came through clean cold, the kind that erases the breath of rooms that have learned to smell like themselves. Beyond the threshold, a staircase descended. Not the polite steps with the worn middle, where generations of compliance have polished stone to flattery. These were new to feet, raw as a choice not yet tried. I took one step and felt the air shift its weight. Behind me, paper made the grateful smack of glue resealing, as if the ledger in the chained room had heard permission and decided to make use of it later. "Don't," the master said, but his tone had too much habit in it to be believed. "This is part of the ritual," he added, "which is what men say when a door offers honesty." "What is it?" the young woman asked. "An exit," he said. "That isn't." He was correct. I descended and found myself in a space shaped like a vault turned inside out. You know the engineering, all the strength on the wrong side, an architecture whose purpose is confession. At the center stood another lectern plainer, lower, with a surface scarred by knives used to sharpen quills when sharpenings were permitted. No candles, no salt, no hammer, just a single sheet of paper and a pen whose nib had been filed to a useful ugliness. The sheet bore no name, but names were the room's only commodity. Above it, carved into the wood, a sentence. "Write what will be deleted when you are not in the room. It is a cruel sentence if you are used to witnesses. It is a merciful one if you are used to committees." I picked up the pen. It scratched with the grateful greed of a tool that has not been made holy, only honest. I wrote, "Agata walked because fog had tried to keep her from walking for me." I wrote, "Isidoro sang off key because the watchers had requested permit grief, disallow grievance, and I wanted a child to have a grievance with the sky." I wrote the lantern was blue because the invented crusade had taught cities to exchange nouns like currency. I wrote the scientist's name and the mapmaker's and the teacher who told children, "Curiosity is a muscle," and I wrote bread is forgiveness because Morello's mother should never have her labor renamed for a saint who liked parades. The pen ran out at remember. Pens do that on purpose. The room approves humility. I put the pen down. The paper did not glow. It lay there with the low radiance of objects that know they are being used properly. Behind me, footsteps. Gisla's voice, soft as responsibility. "If we carry that upstairs, we make it behave," I finished. "We turn testimony into exhibit. Exhibits die of good lighting. So what do we do?" "Leave it," I said. "Let the room keep custody. Some truths need to belong to air that learns slowly." We climbed. The door closed. The master had the decency not to ask what had occurred. He resumed his staging. 3 more names that would be rendered legible but unable to bruise. 3 more circles. 3 more performances of refusal that left the architecture intact and the furniture pleased. We ended with a prayer anyone could have loved. Not for victory, not for glory, but for tidiness. It is the only prayer buildings know how to answer on schedule. Afterward, while the officials coordinated their innocence and the scholars arranged their weariness for display, we 4 lingered. The young woman with her verbs ajar, the old priest who had learned to bless ledgers with a sigh, Morello with his hat finely on his head like a decision, and Sister Gisela with her hood in her hand. The master extinguished the salted wicks with a little silver cup, so politely you could almost forget what salt remembers. "There is bread," Morello said, "because salvation, when it is honest, is small." We ate. We did not speak. Chewing is an ethics. Then the ledger called. You do not hear it with your ears. You feel it in the glue of the world. We followed the sound to the chained room. The lattice opened. The gospel bowed. The Magdalene kept her seam. The catalogue of dissolved devices gave off the faint warmth of effort remembered. And the ledger of fallen stars, no longer, not yet, not exactly now, had placed itself so that if you were a person with a name, you would have to trip over it. I put my hand on the leather and learned a sentence. It did not write itself on the page. It wrote itself behind my eyes, the way constellations do when a child decides the sky is simpler than the charts say. Don't stop asking questions. The most dangerous thing to them is memory coming back. It was not a threat. It was not even advice. It was inventory. The ledger had tallied our refusals, our compliance, our small verbs, our salted wicks, our puncta, our pins in fog, our baker's mother's tears, the blue lantern, the masks that fit any face, the compass that replaced north with obedience, the breathing map that widened an inlet into a bay for a cousin's reluctant money. It had counted and discovered a remainder, us. Remainders break chairs on schedule. Remainders teach streets to accept their old widths again. Remainders make watchers rest. The basilica above struck the proper hour with relief. The 13th folded itself into a pocket like a letter no one dares throw away. We wrote in the boring ledger with backs mice appreciate. Ritual performed. Witness refused. Names legible. Pressure reduced. A door opened to a non-exit. A page accepted a sentence it can keep only if no one frames it. No stamp applied. Pending the child who will carve the date into stone. We signed with and without suffixes and crossed out what felt like vanity. Then we let the room return to being a room. I left by the corridor that does not wish to be remembered, and I climbed into a city that had resumed its parade of good intentions. Pigeons read the air with their little parables. Guides narrated ceilings into compliance. A boy ran off-key beside his mother's bicycle. She laughed. You can edit a calendar, and you can rename hunger, and you can salt a wick until wax remembers nothing but obedience. But laughter is a ledger that keeps its own accounts. That night, I slept without dreams, because the rooms had decided to do my dreaming for me. They are good friends that way when they are tired of being houses. In the morning, I took off my key ring and my rope and my suffix, and I kept only the broom, because a broom is the one tool you can carry without being accused of believing yourself essential. I swept, I logged. I learned the faces of doors that consent to be honest, and the voices of candles that have met the sea. I refused. Then I agreed. I balanced. I aired. I corrected. Small verbs, durable verbs. You will expect an escape. The exit door that wasn't taught me that escape is sometimes the wrong romance. We do not leave. We stay until the house mistakes our staying for a hinge. Then, very slowly, rooms begin to open because endurance is the only key that cannot be copied by a committee. I stayed. I stay still. If you ask for a moral, I will pretend not to hear. Morals are costumes. I have only a practice. It goes like this. When a calendar wants to be a staircase, count in spirals. When a book wants to be a sermon, read its receipts. When a map breathes, breathe with it until the inlet becomes a bay and a cousin's reluctance turns honest. When the watchers file their edits, submit a punctum. When fog asks for a name, give it one you can pronounce without permission. When hunger arrives dressed as a fast, call a baker. When a ritual requests a refusal, refuse in verbs so small they can evade the masks. And when the ledger, your ledger, any ledger offers you a sentence, do not ask whether it is true in public. Ask whether it is useful in kitchens. Then, if it is, write it where committees do not think to look. I wrote mine. The room kept it. If you're listening in bed, if your room is dim and your eyes are heavy, consider this a small, durable sentence you can carry into morning. Don't stop asking questions. The most dangerous thing to them is memory coming back. Ask the kind that can be answered by hands. What day did your grandmother leave her village? What color was the lantern when the procession passed? Which saint did your father whisper to when the official saint was busy? How many loaves did the baker call forgiveness? And what did he call the ones he burned? Keep a private ledger, not a conspiracy and index. Names the fog tried to keep for itself. Dates the city nudged away from your feet. Maps your ribs learned while you were walking home. Copy quotations by hand. Photograph marginalia. Label the blank spine. Stamp nothing until a child carves it in stone. Practice small verbs until they are strong enough to lift a century by the corner and let it breathe. If you do, stories will remember they have lungs. Rooms will remember they are people. And when the 13th hour returns, because it will, because hesitation is a seam and seams are invitations, you will know what to bring. A broom, a heel of bread, a punctum, a pinhole, a question. The door will forget to lock itself, and we who stamp and sew and sweep will be there. Not to burn anything, not to bless everything, but to keep custody while memory comes back at the speed of air.